Hey there, story lovers. This is Arcane Paradox, and we're bringing you an epic adventure. St. Mungo's healer scan at age 7 found 93 memory wipes on Harry and Gringotts declared war on Britain. Hit like, subscribe, and let's begin this journey. Chapter 1, The Scan. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Petunia Dursley didn't open it at first. She stood at the kitchen counter with it pinched between two fingers like it might bite her, reading the Ministry of Magic seal embossed in purple wax as though hoping it might change into something less threatening if she stared long enough. It didn't. It stayed exactly what it was, official, heavy, and addressed not to her, but to the guardian of Harry James Potter. Vernon lumbered in from the sitting room, sock-footed and carrying a biscuit. "What's that?" "Ministry thing." She set it on the counter. "About the boy." Vernon's face did the thing it always did when Harry came up, a slow, blotchy reddening, like a thermometer rising. What they want now? Health check, apparently. She'd finally torn it open, smoothing the parchment against the countertop. Her eyes moved quickly over the official language, the formal clauses, the dates. Mandatory. New law. All magical children under 10 must attend a St. Mungo's diagnostic before the 1st of September. It says non-compliance results in a fine and a home visit from the Department of Magical Child Welfare. Home visit, Vernon repeated. Yes. They looked at each other. Book the appointment, Vernon said, and went back to the sitting room. Petunia folded the letter very precisely along its original creases and slid it into the junk drawer where she kept things she didn't know what to do with. She stood there for a moment with her hand still resting on the drawer, looking at nothing in particular. Then she called upstairs. "Boy! Come down and eat your breakfast." Harry came down the stairs with the particular careful quietness he'd developed over 7 years of living in this house, not tiptoeing, exactly, but moving with a kind of constant low-level awareness of where he was in relation to everybody else. He ate his toast standing at the counter because Dudley had claimed both chairs at the breakfast table and Harry had learned it wasn't worth the argument before 8 in the morning. He was small for 7. Not unhealthily small in any way that a stranger would clock immediately, but small in the way that a plant grows small when it doesn't get quite enough sun, technically fine, technically surviving, but with a faint sense that there was more to it if the conditions had been different. He had his mother's eyes. Nobody had ever told him that. "Eat faster," Petunia said, not looking at him. "We've an appointment." "Where?" Harry asked. "Hospital." Harry's hand stilled on his toast. "Am I sick?" "It's a checkup." "Oh." He ate faster, because she'd told him to, and because the word hospital had done something cold to his stomach even though he didn't know why. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries occupied what looked, from the outside, like an abandoned department store on a street in central London. The sign still said Purge and Douse, limited in flaking gold paint, and the mannequins in the grimy front window stared blankly at passing muggles who glanced at them without seeing anything worth seeing. Petunia had to be walked through the entrance by a harassed-looking ministry escort because magical building entry for Muggle adults of magical children fell under a specific subclause of the Magical Minors Act that she hadn't read carefully enough to understand. She walked through the solid glass of the shop window with her shoulders rigid and her face the careful blank of a woman who has decided that whatever is happening is not, technically, happening to her. Harry walked through behind her and forgot to be frightened because the inside was extraordinary. The reception hall was tall and bright and smelled faintly of healing charms, something warm and faintly botanical, not quite flowers. Healers in lime green robes moved with purpose through the space. A boy about Harry's age sat in a waiting chair with his hand wrapped in bandages that were smoking slightly at the edges and grinning at it like this was the best thing that had happened to him all week. An elderly witch near the window was knitting what appeared to be a very long hat for a very thin person while her companion, equally elderly, offered occasional commentary that she ignored entirely. Harry stood in the entrance and looked at all of it and felt something he couldn't name, something like recognition, which didn't make any sense because he'd never been here before. He was fairly sure. Petunia checked in at the front desk in a voice pitched to carry as little as possible. The Medowitch behind the counter, cheerful, round-faced, unbothered by Muggle visitors, directed them to the third floor. Diagnostic Services and Developmental Assessment. The waiting room on the third floor was quieter. Softer chairs, pastel walls, a few framed prints of magical landscapes that moved gently, a waterfall, a meadow with a tree full of glowing fruit, a night sky where the stars rearranged themselves slowly into different patterns. Harry sat in a chair that was slightly too big for him and watched the stars until they called his name. The healer who came to collect him was a woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had the look of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything but retained a crisp, functional energy that made Harry think she would be good in an emergency. "Harry Potter," she said, and then, when he slid off the chair, "I'm Healer Stroud. Miriam Stroud." "Come on, then." She looked at Petunia. "Family is welcome to wait here. The diagnostic itself takes about 20 minutes. You'll be the first to know the results." Petunia sat down with her handbag in her lap and said nothing. Harry followed Healer Stroud through a door that closed very softly behind them. The examination room was small and clean and had a high window that let in a bar of dusty afternoon light. There was a padded table in the center, a complicated-looking instrument on a side counter that resembled a brass microscope crossed with an astrolabe, and a comfortable chair beside the table which Healer Stroud gestured Harry toward instead. "You don't have to sit up on the table," she said. "The chair's fine. This isn't that sort of checkup." Harry sat in the chair. He watched her pull on a pair of thin white gloves and begin adjusting the instrument on the counter. "What does that do?" he asked. "It reads the history of your magical core," Healer Stroud said, without looking up. "Every piece of magic that's ever touched you, your own accidental magic, spells cast near you, charms placed on you. It makes a record. Like a photograph, but of invisible things." She glanced over at him then. "Does that make sense?" "Sort of," Harry said. "Like a receipt." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like a receipt. You're a clever boy." Harry didn't know what to do with that, so he said nothing. The instrument had a single arm that extended toward him when Healer Stroud activated it with her wand, a gentle, questing sort of motion, like a compass needle finding north. It stopped about 6 inches from Harry's chest and began to rotate slowly, the brass fittings catching the afternoon light. A thin ribbon of what looked like pale gold smoke rose from the top and collected in a glass chamber above the mechanism. Harry watched it. It was interesting. He didn't feel anything. Healer Stroud moved back to her desk and opened a ledger, actual parchment, actual quill, and began noting things in a professional shorthand as the instrument ran its process. She glanced at the numbers occasionally. Made notes. Glanced again. The quill slowed. Harry looked away from the instrument and back at her because her face had changed in a way he noticed without being able to name it. She was staring at the instrument's readout. The quill had stopped moving entirely. "Healer Stroud?" Harry said. "Just a moment." Her voice was very level. Very controlled. She crossed to the instrument, bent close, and read something off the measuring dial. Then she straightened up and looked at Harry with an expression that she was working very hard to keep professional and not entirely succeeding. "Harry," she said, "I'm going to ask you to sit tight for just a few more minutes. I need to bring in a colleague to double-check some of these readings. Standard procedure for certain results. Is something wrong with me?" "Nothing is wrong with you," she said, and the emphasis was slight but unmistakable, and Harry filed it away because he had spent 7 years learning to notice things that adults didn't realize they were communicating. "Just sit tight." She went out. Harry sat in the chair and looked at the instrument, which was still rotating slowly, trailing its ribbon of golden smoke, recording a history that apparently warranted a second opinion. He looked at his hands. Small hands. A scar on the back of his left knuckle from the time he'd grabbed the hot oven rack reaching for something Dudley hadn't wanted. He couldn't remember what he'd been trying to get. He sat very still and waited. Healer Stroud moved down the corridor at a pace just below running, knocked twice on the door marked Chief Diagnostician, M. Ogilvy, and walked in without waiting for an answer. Marcus Ogilvy was 63 years old, had been a diagnostic healer for 35 of those years, and had a reputation for being the calmest person in any given room regardless of the circumstances. He looked up from his desk with the mild expression of someone who had not been interrupted like this since the Bludger incident of 1987. "Miriam," he said. "I need you to look at a scan," she said, and put the preliminary readout on his desk. It was parchment, but the numbers on it were wrong. They were wrong in a way that made the parchment feel wrong, like the paper itself objected to what it had been asked to record. Ogilvy looked at the readout. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at it again. "These are preliminary," he said. "I know. The instrument could be, I recalibrated it last week. It's not the instrument." She sat down across from him because her legs had made a unilateral decision about this. "Marcus, I need you to look at the full scan." He was already standing. The full diagnostic scan was more involved. It required both healers operating the instrument together, a secondary recording charm running in parallel, and a verbal timestamp for the official record. Healer Ogilvy explained this to Harry in the calm, thorough way of someone who had explained many things to many children and knew that children handled scary things better when they were told the truth about the procedure, even if not yet the results. Harry submitted to all of it with a stillness that was slightly unsettling in a 7-year-old, not the stillness of boredom or resignation, but something more deliberate. He watched everything. He missed nothing. "You can ask questions," Ogilvy said at one point. "I know," Harry said. "I'm saving them." Ogilvy exchanged a look with Stroud, who was watching the instrument's readout with the focused attention of someone who desperately wants to be wrong. She was not wrong. The full scan confirmed the preliminary numbers and added granular detail that made it worse, not better. The instrument produced a long ribbon of recorded data, actual parchment, enchanted to transcribe magical signatures, and the ribbon curled to the floor and kept going, and the number at the top right corner of the first sheet read 93. 93 instances. Healer Stroud had seen obliviation scans before. She'd run them on accident victims, on trauma cases, on people who'd been illegally wiped by dark practitioners. She'd once scanned a man who'd been wiped 11 times by an organized crime operation and filed it as the worst case she'd ever seen. 93. She picked up the ribbon of parchment from the beginning and began reading the first entry. The magical signature attached to the initial wipe. The date. Harry had been 14 months old. She set the parchment down. "Harry," she said, and her voice was doing something she couldn't fully control, "I'm going to step out and speak with my colleague for just a moment. Are you all right in here on your own?" "Yes," Harry said. He was looking at her very directly. "What does the number 93 mean?" The room was very quiet. Ogilvy made a small sound. "It means," Healer Stroud said, because she had decided in the half-second available to her that this boy deserved honesty, "that we found evidence of 93 instances of a specific kind of spell being used on you. We need to understand it better before we can explain it properly. Can you give me 10 minutes? "What kind of spell?" "A memory spell." Harry's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. Something shifted behind his eyes, a slight recalibration, like a compass adjusting, and then he said, very quietly, "Okay. 10 minutes." She went out. In the corridor, Healer Ogilvy pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds. 14 months, Stroud said. The first one was when he was 14 months old. "I saw. The signatures," she stopped. "Started again. Some of them are professional. Trained obliviators. 3 of them are minister registered. I recognize the magical signature pattern on at least 6 of them. She stopped again. The corridor was empty. She lowered her voice anyway. That's Albus Dumbledore's signature, Marcus. Ogilvy said nothing for a long moment. We are mandated reporters, he said finally. I know. The Magical Minors Act is very clear. Any evidence of unauthorized magical interference with a minor, I know. She was already thinking ahead. Already calculating. Already afraid, which she was choosing to treat as irrelevant. I need to contact the DMLE. Not the general line. Not the duty officer. I need Amelia Bones directly. She's the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Miriam. You can't just, if I route this through normal channels and someone in the normal channels has one of those signatures, this disappears before the ink dries. She looked at him squarely. You know I'm right. Ogilvy was quiet for a moment. What about the boy? He's in there right now working out that something is very wrong and not getting upset about it, which is actually the most disturbing part of this whole afternoon. She straightened her robes. He's 7 years old and he's already learned to wait for information instead of reacting to uncertainty. That's not what healthy 7-year-olds look like, Marcus. That's a child who has learned that reacting doesn't get him anywhere. Ogilvy looked at her for a moment. Go make your call. I'll sit with the boy. Harry liked Healer Ogilvy. He was the kind of adult who didn't talk to children the way a radio talks to an empty room, broadcasting steadily without checking if anyone was listening. He sat down in the spare chair and asked Harry what he liked, and when Harry said the stars, the moving ones on the wall in the waiting room, Ogilvy asked him what he knew about stars, and they talked about that for a while, and Harry found that he knew quite a lot about stars without being sure how he'd learned it because nobody at his school had taught him and the Dursleys certainly hadn't. I read, Harry said, which was true, but reading didn't quite cover it. He'd always just known things, sometimes. Like they'd been put there and then forgotten about. He thought about that while Ogilvy was talking, and he thought about the number 93, and he thought about how Healer Stroud's voice had done that small, careful thing when she told him what kind of spell it was. A memory spell. He knew what that meant in the broad sense. He'd read enough, he'd found books in the school library, mostly accidentally, to know that there were spells that affected memory. He was 7, not uninformed. What he was thinking about, sitting in the examination chair while Healer Ogilvy talked about constellation mythology, was a very simple and very strange question. If someone had used a memory spell on him 93 times, then 93 times he had known something and then not known it. What had he known? He had a sudden, vertiginous feeling, not quite dizziness, not quite nausea, more like looking down at the floor and finding it slightly further away than expected. A sense of depth that hadn't been there a moment ago. What had he known? Healer Stroud found a fireplace on the 3rd floor used for inter-hospital communication, keyed it for private use with her hospital authorization code, and fled Amelia Bones' direct office contact. She expected to leave a message. Amelia Bones picked up personally on the 3rd call, which told Stroud that Bones was the kind of administrator who kept her own Fleur active rather than routing everything through a secretary. Stroud, St. Mungo's, Diagnostic Services, Stroud said. I need to report under mandatory disclosure, Magical Minors Act 1990, Section 7. I have a 7-year-old patient showing 93 instances of obliviation. Stop, Bones said. Not rudely. Just with the flat, absolute authority of someone who had learned to stop information from getting lost in transit. Start again. Slowly. Name of the child. Stroud told her. There was a silence on the other end of the floor that lasted exactly 4 seconds and felt like 4 minutes. Don't let him leave the building, Bones said. Don't let his guardian take him. If she attempts to remove him, you have St. Mungo's authority under Section 7 to invoke protective custody pending investigation. Do you understand that? Yes. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't speak to anyone else about this until I arrive. Not the chief healer. Not the administration. No one. Understood. There's something else. Stroud hesitated for only half a second. The magical signatures. I recognized some of them. Who? Stroud told her. Another silence. Longer this time. 20 minutes, Bones said, and the floor went dark. Back in the waiting room on the third floor, Petunia Dursley sat with her handbag and her rigid spine and her carefully arranged face and told herself that everything was fine and that the appointment was running long because hospitals always ran long. She had told herself this for approximately 45 minutes. It was becoming less convincing. A Medowitch had come to ask if she wanted tea. She'd said yes, then no, then yes again, and the tea was sitting on the table beside her going cold because every time she reached for it she found she didn't want it. She was not a stupid woman. Whatever her other failings, and she was, in the privacy of her own skull, aware that she had some, she had never been stupid. She had known, on some low-frequency level of awareness that she generally kept firmly below conscious thought, that what she had participated in over the last 7 years was not entirely defensible. It had been presented to her as necessary. As safe. As the only way to make the situation manageable. The man, always the same man, with his half-moon glasses and his insufferable certainty, had explained it in reasonable terms and she had chosen to accept those terms because the alternative was harder. Now she sat in the waiting room with her cold tea and her rigid spine and waited, and the alternative sat in the room with her like something with weight. When Amelia Bones arrived, sensible robes, a square, uncompromising face, and the kind of posture that announced she was nobody's afternoon, Petunia recognized authority immediately and straightened involuntarily. Bones looked at her for exactly as long as necessary. Mrs. Dursley. I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I'll need you to remain here, please. She turned away before Petunia could respond and went through the door to the corridor without breaking stride. Petunia's hand found the cold cup of tea. She held it with both hands and said nothing. Harry heard the door open and new footsteps in the corridor, purposeful footsteps, the kind that moved like they had somewhere to be and were already there, and Healer Stroud came back in, and behind her was a woman Harry had never seen before with close-cropped gray hair and a way of assessing a room in one look that reminded him, obliquely, of the way teachers looked at a class when they suspected someone had done something. Harry, Healer Stroud said, this is Amelia Bones. She works for the ministry. I know what the ministry is, Harry said. Amelia Bones sat down across from him and looked at him with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had interviewed a very large number of people over a very long career and found that children often told you more than adults because they hadn't learned yet to manage what their faces did. Harry Potter, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Do you know why we're all in this room? Because of the 93, Harry said. Bones looked at Stroud briefly. Stroud looked at her desk. Yes, Bones said. Because of the 93. Do you know what that means yet? Memory spells, Harry said. Someone cast memory spells on me 93 times. He was watching her face the way he watched adults' faces, cataloging, reading, filing. You know who did it. Bones said, we have some initial information about the magical signatures on the spells. Yes. You don't want to tell me. I think you're entitled to know the truth, Bones said carefully. But I also think you're 7 years old, and there's a conversation about what we know that needs to be handled properly, by people who know how to support you through it. I'm not going to fall apart, Harry said. No, Bones agreed, and something in her voice suggested that this fact, specifically, was its own kind of concerning. I can see that. But there are still processes that matter, for your protection. Not to manage you. To give you a foundation to stand on when you find out the rest of it. Harry looked at her for a long moment. His eyes, green and steady and entirely too old for his face, held hers without difficulty. Okay, he said. What happens now? Right now, Bones said, St. Mungo's is going to invoke something called protective custody. It means you'll stay here, safe, while we investigate. I'm going to need to ask you some questions, nothing difficult, nothing frightening. Just things about your life. Can you do that? Yes, Harry said. Then, my aunt is in the waiting room. I know. Is she in trouble? Bones was quiet for a moment. That depends on what we find out. Harry nodded. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Bones. Are there really 93, he said. You're sure about the number? The scan is confirmed, Healer Stroud said, quietly. Right. Harry was quiet for a moment. The bar of afternoon light had shifted while they'd been talking. It was lower now, hitting the side of the instrument on the counter, casting a long shadow across the floor. Harry looked at the shadow. He was thinking about the stars in the waiting room, the ones that rearranged themselves into patterns. He was thinking about what it would mean to look up at the sky and know that you were only seeing some of the stars, that other stars were there, that had always been there, that someone had carefully covered with their hand. What had he known? What had he been about to understand, 93 times, that someone had decided he shouldn't? The fury that moved through him then was quiet and thorough and not frightening, not to him, anyway. It was more like something settling into place. A calibration. A compass finding true north. He was 7 years old. He was sitting in a hospital room that smelled faintly of healing charms. There were 93 things that had been taken from him, and he didn't know yet what any of them were, and the people who had done it had presumably had reasons that they considered perfectly good. He was going to find out all of it. He was going to find out every single piece of it. And nobody, was going to convince him that any reason was good enough. He looked up at Amelia Bones, who was still watching him with that careful, assessing attention, and he said, "When can we start?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face, brief, involuntary, the expression of someone who has just discovered that a situation they expected to be manageable is going to be considerably more interesting than that. "Now," she said. "We start now." In her office on the 3rd floor, Healer Miriam Stroud sat at her desk with the scan results in front of her and her hands flat on the parchment. The scan ribbon coiled on the desk between her palms, 93 signatures recorded in the golden gray language of diagnostic magic, each one a small, precise erasure. She thought about the boy in the examination room. The steadiness of him. The way he'd asked his questions like he was collecting supplies for a journey he'd already decided to take. She thought about the signature she'd recognized, the one she'd reported to Amelia Bones in the Fleur call. The one that appeared on 11 of the 93. Distinctive in the way that all-powerful magic was distinctive, not just in its execution but in its flavor, the specific quality of the magical force behind it. She'd seen it in case files. She'd seen it on official correspondence. She'd seen it in the historical records she'd had to study in her healer training under the section titled Significant Magical Signatures of the 20th Century. She'd known it immediately. She pressed her hands flat on the parchment and thought about what it meant to know something that you couldn't unknow, and she thought about how the boy in the next room had been given that experience 93 times by people who had decided it was for his own good. She pulled the scan ribbon to her, picked up her quill, and began writing her formal mandatory disclosure report. She wrote it very carefully. She wrote every number, every date, every signature. She wrote it as a healer, with the precise, exhaustive attention to detail that her training demanded, because she understood that this document was going to matter. This document was going to be the thing that either held or broke, depending on how well it was written. She wrote it like it was the most important thing she'd ever done, because she was fairly sure it was. 3 floors below, Petunia Dursley sat in the waiting room with her cold tea and her cold hands, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily toward an evening that was going to be very different from any evening she had planned. And in the examination room, Harry Potter sat across from Amelia Bones and began answering questions with the careful, clear attention of someone who had just discovered that the last 7 years of his life were a map drawn by someone else, and who had decided, with the absolute unsentimentality of a child who has learned that the world is not fair and has chosen to be unimpressed by this fact, that he was going to draw his own. Chapter 2, the ledger the audit had been running for 6 weeks. This was not unusual. Gringotts ran quarterly audits on all vaults above a certain asset threshold. It was standard practice, encoded in the bank's founding charter, predating the British Ministry of Magic by 400 years. The goblins had been doing this longer than wizards had been pretending they didn't need them to. What was unusual was that this particular audit had been flagged 3 times in its first week by the automated ledger-checking charms, and each time the flagging charm had been manually overridden by someone with level 4 vault access, and each time that override had been logged in the secondary record system that level 4 access couldn't touch. And when Junior Auditor Skerrick had compiled the secondary logs and taken them to his supervisor Dresk had looked at them for approximately 90 seconds and then taken them directly to Ragnarok. Not to Ragnarok's secretary. Not to his scheduling clerk. Not through the formal request process that involved 3 forms and a 2-week wait. Directly to Ragnarok. This was the sort of decision that ended careers in most organizations. In Gringotts, it was the sort of decision that ended careers only if you were wrong. If you were right, it was the sort of decision that got remembered. Dresk was not wrong. Ragnarok's office was at the deepest level of Gringotts' administrative complex, which was itself well below the vault levels, which were themselves considerably below street level. The office had no windows. Windows were a surface-dweller affectation, but the walls were lined with phosphorescent stone that had been mined from a seam 4 miles beneath the Scottish Highlands and gave off a cold, clean, bluish-white light that Ragnarok had always found clarifying. He was old. Not ancient by goblin reckoning, but old enough to have held this position for 31 years, old enough to remember when the last war had ended and the terms that magical Britain had dictated in its aftermath, terms that the goblin nation had accepted because the alternative at the time was worse. Old enough to have spent 3 decades watching those terms erode, watching the ministry's attitude toward goblin sovereignty calcify from condescension into something that had given up even the pretense of courtesy. He sat behind his desk, black stone, unornamented, the surface worn smooth by decades of use, and read Dresk's compiled report with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing for a very long time and is now watching it arrive. Skerrick stood to one side. Dresk stood to the other. Neither of them spoke. Ragnarok read the entire report. Every column. Every figure. Every logged override and secondary record and cross-referenced vault entry going back 30 years. He read with the thoroughness of a surgeon and the patience of stone. When he finished, he set the report down on the desk with a small, precise motion and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, Dresk. War Chief. Total figures. Dresk had them ready. He always had things ready. From the Potter family vaults alone, 847,000 galleons withdrawn over 22 years under forged authorization. The trust vault established for the minor Harry James Potter, which under Goblin law and the terms of the Potter family charter is sealed to all access except the vault holder upon reaching 7 years of age, has been accessed 41 times. He paused. The Black family accounts show a further 1.2 million galleons redirected through a series of ministry-authorized legacy management orders that our records indicate were filed under a power of attorney that was never legally established. Because Sirius Black was never tried, Ragnarok said. No, War Chief. He was imprisoned without trial. Under Goblin law, a person imprisoned without trial retains full legal personhood. The power of attorney filed on his behalf is therefore fraudulent. And the management orders filed under that fraudulent power of attorney are themselves fraudulent. Yes. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Who filed them? The ministry registered agent of record on all 41 trust vault accesses is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Dresk said it the way you'd say a diagnosis, factual, direct, absent of drama, which in context was its own form of drama. The Black estate power of attorney was filed by the same office. 3 signatures on the Potter family withdrawal authorizations also resolved to Dumbledore's registered magical signature. A further 11 resolved to Ministry Obliviator Department signatures. 4 resolved to private individuals we're in the process of identifying. Ragnarok looked at Skerrick. You flagged this in the first week. The numbers were wrong, War Chief, Skerrick said. He was young, barely past his first century, and he had the carefully neutral expression of someone trying very hard not to show that he was deeply, profoundly proud of himself. The account pattern didn't match the declared transactions. I ran the secondary check as a matter of protocol. Good instincts, Ragnarok said, which for Ragnarok was roughly equivalent to someone else throwing a parade. Skerrick maintained his neutral expression with visible effort. Who else has seen this report? No one outside this room, Dresk said. I came directly to you. The flagging overrides. Who authorized them? Ministry Liaison Office. A wizard named Weatherby, senior assistant to the minister. The override requests came through the official liaison channel, which is why they had level 4 access. Dresk's tone was the precise neutral of a professional who has decided to let the facts carry the outrage so he doesn't have to. He presumably assumed the secondary logging system didn't exist. Everyone assumes that, Ragnarok said. It's why we've never publicized it. He stood up. When Ragnarok stood, the room reorganized itself around him, not because he was imposing in the physical way that wizards imagined goblins to be, but because there was a quality of attention that came off him when he moved with purpose that made the room feel smaller and more focused. He walked to the far wall, where a single shelf held a row of bound ledgers, old ones, leather-covered, their spines marked with dates going back centuries. He found the one he wanted without searching and brought it back to the desk. Do you know what this is? He asked Dresk. A ledger, War Chief. The ledger, Ragnarok said. This is the record of the last 6 agreements made between Gringotts and the British Ministry of Magic. He set it on the desk. The last time I opened this book was in 1994, when Fudge attempted to renegotiate the curse-breaking commission rates and discovered that our founding charter contains clauses that the ministry's own legal department had apparently never bothered to read. He opened the ledger to a marked page. This clause, specifically. Dresk leaned forward slightly. Read it. His eyes moved back to Ragnarok. That's a war clause, he said. Yes. The ministry will call it disproportionate. The ministry, Ragnarok said, stole from a child. A child whose parents were murdered. They stole from a 7-year-old orphan's trust vault 41 times using forged authorization from a man who also apparently had the child's memories erased 93 times. Dresk went very still. How do you know about the memory wipes? Because Gringotts has an account manager assigned to every family vault above a Class 3 threshold, and the account manager assigned to the Potter family vault is one of mine, and she was contacted by St. Mungo's Hospital this afternoon under the Magical Minors Act cross-reporting protocol because the medical examination of Harry Potter referenced potential financial crimes tied to his guardianship. Ragnarok's voice had not risen. It never rose. It had simply become more precise, each word placed like something heavy set down on a table. The hospital's report named the same magical signature we found on the withdrawal authorizations. Albus Dumbledore. The office was very quiet. The phosphorescent walls hummed faintly, their cold light perfectly steady. Skerrick, Ragnarok said. War Chief. You found this. It's yours to carry. I'm assigning you to the War Council documentation team. Everything you've compiled, every secondary log, every cross-reference, every figure, needs to be in an ICW standard filing package by tomorrow morning. He paused. Intact. Nothing softened. Nothing summarized. The full picture. Skerrick, who had been standing in this room trying not to look like a junior auditor who had accidentally started a war, nodded once with the composure of someone who was going to feel the full magnitude of this later, probably at 3 a.m, probably with shaking hands, and who had made his peace with that. Understood, War Chief. Go. Skerrick went. Ragnarok's War Council convened at midnight. It met in the Chamber of Reckoning, which was the oldest room in Gringotts and the one most clearly designed not for commerce but for conflict. The table was black stone, the same vein as Ragnar's desk, which was not a coincidence, and it seated 14, and all 14 seats were filled. The War Council of Gringotts was not, as wizards tended to imagine, a collection of ancient goblins in formal robes debating abstractions. It was a working body, military commanders, legal strategists, financial tacticians, and one historian whose job was to ensure that whatever decision was made tonight was consistent with precedent and couldn't be unraveled by retroactive reinterpretation. The historian's name was Griphook the Elder, and he was the oldest person in the room by a significant margin, and the look on his face as Dresk presented the compiled report was the look of someone watching a long-running theory finally submit to evidence. "We've been building toward this for 30 years, Griphook said, when Dresk finished. The treaty violations began before the current administration. They've been systematic. Incremental. Each individual violation small enough to contest without seeming worth it. Aggregated," he gestured at the report. "This. The ICW filing," said Nalark, the military commander on Ragnar's right. She was lean and scarred and had a reputation for tactical patience that made her more dangerous than those who relied on aggression. "What's our argument?" "Three interlocking arguments," said the legal strategist across from her, Bitterstone, who had studied wizarding law for 60 years and found it mostly disappointing. "First, the forged authorizations on the Potter Vault constitute breach of the banking charter's anti-fraud provisions, which under the founding agreement carry a right of punitive recovery. Second, the imprisonment of Sirius Black without trial, which invalidated all subsequently filed powers of attorney on the Black estate, constitutes wizarding state fraud against goblin banking institutions, which is a war clause offense under Article 7 of the 1752 Accord." She paused. "Third, and most interesting, Harry Potter is 7 years old. Under the Potter family charter, filed with Gringotts in 1243, the family's eldest male heir exceeds to full lordship at 7 years of age. He is therefore, right now, tonight, Lord Potter. His account has been accessed without his consent and without legal authorization. Under our law, not theirs, that constitutes theft from a sovereign. Wizards won't accept his lordship claim," Nalark said. "Wizards will need to find a legal argument against a charter that predates their ministry by 4 centuries, Bitterstone said pleasantly. "I've looked. There isn't one." Ragnar had been listening without speaking. This was his standard practice in council, he gathered the full picture before adding his weight to it. He looked at the historian now. "Griphook. Precedent." Griphook the Elder folded his hands on the table. "The last formal declaration of war between the Goblin Nation and magical Britain was 1752. At that time, the precipitating cause was the unauthorized seizure of the Lorcott family hoard following the execution of Gorgak the Younger, who was also imprisoned without trial." He paused to let that sit. "We won. The terms of the 1752 Accord, which are still in force, include specific language about the right to declaration in cases of repeated and systematic financial fraud against goblin institutions. They included this language because they knew they were going to do it again." Another pause. They were right. The room was quiet. Ragnar looked at each of his council members in turn. He did this not because he needed to count votes, the council advised, it didn't vote, the decision was his, but because he believed in looking at the people who were going to carry the weight of a decision before he made it. What he saw in the faces around the table was not eagerness. He'd have distrusted eagerness. What he saw was clarity, the specific quality of attention that came from people who had spent a long time understanding something and were now watching the understanding resolve into action. "The declaration will not be sent to the ministry," Ragnar said. "It will be filed with the International Confederation of Wizards first. Simultaneously delivered to every attached national bank, every ICW member institution, and published in full in the Gringotts public record." He looked at Bitterstone. "Draft it tonight. Full legal language. Full citation of the treaty clauses. Complete financial record attached as evidence." He looked at Nalark. "The military component?" "Financial warfare first," Nalark said. We freeze every ministry-linked account that has been used to receive unauthorized transfers. We place holds on every Gringotts vault that shows forged authorization paperwork. We call in every outstanding ministry debt, and there are 47 of them, immediately and simultaneously. A pause. If they want to escalate to physical conflict, we're prepared. But I'd rather watch them try to run a government without access to their own money first. Agreed. Ragnock straightened. One more thing. He looked around the table. Harry Potter. The boy himself. He is Lord Potter, under our law and under his own family charter. He is currently in St. Mungo's hospital under protective custody. He has been robbed, manipulated, and had his memories repeatedly erased since he was 14 months old. The room was very quiet. He is our client, Ragnock said. He has been our client since birth, under the terms of his family's charter. We failed him. Gringotts failed him, not through malice, but through a combination of trusting surface-dweller institutional honesty that we had no reason to trust and a record-keeping vulnerability that has now been corrected. He looked at the compiled audit report on the table. That failure ends tonight. The declaration is one part of what happens next. The other part is that Gringotts formally reaches out to Lord Potter, Harry Potter, and informs him of his status, his assets, and what has been done with them. He paused. And we give him the option to direct the nature of this war himself. Nallark looked up. He's 7. He's 7, Ragnock agreed, and he sat in a hospital room today and found out that 93 memories had been taken from him and asked immediately when he could start investigating. I read the St. Mungo's preliminary report. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite respect, but some combination of both that looked very natural on goblin features. I am not concerned about his capacity. Bitterstone drafted the declaration in 4 hours. She was good at this, the particular legal alchemy of translating righteous fury into precise, unassailable language. She worked in her office with 2 assistants and a pot of black tea and the complete Gringotts founding charter open on the desk beside her, cross-referencing as she went. The declaration, when finished, was 14 pages long. The evidence appendix was 63 pages. The financial record attached to it was 207 pages of authenticated audit documentation, every figure triple-checked and signed by 3 senior auditors including Dresk, who had barely slept. It was filed with the ICW at 6 in the morning via the secure international flow document system. It was delivered by armored messenger to the British Ministry of Magic at 6:15. It was published in the Gringotts Public Record at 6:30. By 7, copies were circulating among every major magical publication in Europe. By 8, the Gringotts Public Notice Board, charmed to display in the main banking hall, readable by every customer who walked in, showed a single statement in 4 languages. Gringotts Bank hereby declares formal dispute with the Ministry of Magic of Magical Britain and all associated parties, pursuant to the Treaty of 1752, Articles 7 through 12. All ministry-linked accounts are subject to immediate audit and hold. Outstanding ministry debts are called due. Full declaration available at the reception desk. By 9, the queue for copies of the full declaration at the reception desk stretched out the front door and onto Diagon Alley. Cornelius Fudge found out at 7:45 when his senior undersecretary, Dolores Umbridge, burst into his office without knocking, which she never did, which told him before she said a word that something was wrong in a way that transcended normal category, and slapped a copy of the declaration on his desk. Fudge read the first page. He read the second page. He turned to Umbridge and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be the voice of a man who had a plan, "Get me Dumbledore." "Dumbledore's name is in the declaration," Umbridge said. A long pause. "Get me Legal," Fudge said. "Legal has been trying to reach you since 6:30. They say the ICW filing takes precedence over anything we can file domestically and the treaty citations are." She paused, and something crossed her face that was interesting to watch, the expression of a woman who has spent years managing information flow finding that the information has escaped the managed channels entirely. "They say the citations are correct. The treaty is real. The clauses are real. Fudge looked at the declaration. He looked at the evidence appendix. He looked at the financial record, which was thick enough to function as a doorstop, and which had the word authenticated stamped on the front in Gringotts' official red ink. 847,000 galleons, he said, reading from the summary page. From the Potter vault alone, Umbridge said, and her voice did a small, involuntary thing on the word alone that she immediately controlled. The Black Estate claims add another, I can read, Fudge said, which was not entirely true in the sense of reading without his brain shutting down in self-defense, but was at least technically accurate. He set the document down and looked at Umbridge with the expression of a man watching the floor move. Dumbledore authorized the withdrawals. According to their records. Yes. That's, Fudge started. It's in the authenticated audit, Umbridge said. Triple signed by Goblin senior auditors. Under ICW rules, that's prima facie evidence unless we can produce contradicting authentication of the same or higher standard. Fudge sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his desk. He looked at the declaration, which was still sitting there, 14 pages of precise legal fury that had been crafted specifically to be unanswerable by the tools he had available. The boy, he said. Potter. He's at St. Mungo's. Protective custody. Bones invoked Section 7 last night. Tell Bones to, I can't tell Bones to do anything, Umbridge said, with the flat precision of someone who has thought this through already. She's head of the DMLE. The only person who can direct her is the minister. And if the minister is seen interfering with the custody of a child who is now named in the Gringotts Declaration as the primary victim of the financial fraud, she stopped. She didn't need to finish. Fudge understood politics, whatever else could be said about him. He understood that there were moments when a position became untenable and the only question was whether you figured that out before or after the public did. He was close to figuring it out. He was not quite there yet. Get me Dumbledore, he said again. Fudge. Umbridge said his name without any title, which she almost never did. It made him look at her directly. Her face was doing something complicated. Dumbledore's signature is on 41 unauthorized trust vault accesses. It's also, apparently, on a series of memory modification events performed on the Potter child. The healers at St. Mungo's have submitted the magical signature evidence to the DMLE already. Bones has it. A pause. If you call Dumbledore in here this morning and he's seen leaving your office, you are associated with his response. Whatever that response is. Fudge looked at her. Distance, she said. Today, the minister is shocked and appalled and fully cooperating with the investigation. A very long moment. Right, Fudge said. Albus Dumbledore read the declaration in his office at Hogwarts at 8 in the morning, delivered by Gringotts' official owl, a large, humorless bird that waited pointedly for acknowledgement of receipt before departing. He read it carefully. He read all 14 pages, then the evidence appendix, then stopped partway through the financial record because he understood the numbers and didn't need to read them twice. He sat for a moment with the document on his desk and his hands folded and his half-moon glasses at the end of his nose, looking at the middle distance. Fawkes, on his perch in the corner, made a soft sound, not the full melody of his song, just a note, questioning. Hush, Dumbledore said, gently. He was thinking. He did this in a way that people who had never seen it often mistook for calm, the stillness, the folded hands, the distant look. It was not calm. It was the intense computational activity of a very powerful mind running rapid triage on a situation that had just changed shape. The shape it had changed into was not good. He had understood the risk. He had always understood the risk. You did not do what he had done without understanding, with clear eyes, that there were risks. The question was whether the risk was worth bearing in service of the larger necessity, and he had answered that question the same way every time he'd faced it over the last 6 years, yes. Because the alternative was a world where Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts already knowing what he was, already aware of his power, already accustomed to being extraordinary, and that boy would be unmanageable. Would be a lightning rod. Would draw attention, danger, complexity, enemies. The boy needed to arrive humble. He needed to arrive with something to prove, something to reach for, something to be guided toward. He needed to be manageable because unmanageable people got people killed, and there was too much at stake for any variable he couldn't control. He had believed this. He still believed it. The problem was that the goblins had found the receipts. He unfolded his hands and reached for his quill, and then stopped. Thought for another moment. Put the quill down. He needed to see the boy. Harry Potter in St. Mungo's protective custody, with Amelia Bones controlling access, with a Gringotts declaration already filed, was not inaccessible. Dumbledore still had relationships, still had the weight of his reputation, still had the informal authority of being the person who had, indisputably and publicly, shaped the magical world's response to Voldemort. That weight was not nothing. It was still considerable. But it was less considerable than it had been yesterday morning. He reached for a piece of parchment and began writing, not to the hospital, not to Bones. To people who could move quietly. To people who understood the larger picture and trusted his judgment because he had given them decades of reasons to trust it. He wrote carefully, and quickly, and with the precision of a man who understood that he had less time than he'd like and intended to use all of it. In the main banking hall of Gringotts, the queue for copies of the declaration had finally eased by mid-morning, but the crowd milling through the hall was larger than usual and considerably more agitated. Conversations bounced off the marble in low, urgent currents. The tellers worked with their usual impassive efficiency, but there were more of them than usual, and several of the senior account managers were visible on the floor, which never happened, moving through the crowd with the alert stillness of people monitoring a situation. Nagnok stood at the end of the longest counter and watched the hall with his arms folded. He was younger than Ragnok by several decades and had, in those decades, developed a reputation that was different from his superiors in one specific way. Ragnok was patient. Nagnok was patient, and he was strategic in a way that had a particular quality to it, the ability to see not just where things were but where they were going, to trace the trajectory of a situation and position himself at the arrival point. It made him very good at banking. It also made him, right now, exactly the right person to be watching the hall. He was watching a specific group of wizards in the corner, 3 men in expensive robes who had been there for 20 minutes not doing any banking. They were talking quietly and looking at the declaration notice board and looking at the declaration notice board in the way that people looked at things they were assessing for vulnerability, not reading them. Nagnok filed this away. Ragnok had assigned him a specific task this morning, alongside the General War Council work. He was to be Harry Potter's primary goblin contact. The account manager, the liaison, the face of Gringotts that the young lord would see first. He had spent the morning reading everything they had on Harry Potter. The family charter, the vault records, the St. Mungo's report summary that had been shared through the cross-reporting protocol. The preliminary assessment of the memory wipe evidence. He had also, with the thoroughness that had made him good at his job, read everything they had on Harry Potter's parents. The Potters. Their wills, their vault designations, their recorded communications with Gringotts over the years. Lily Potter had written to the bank 4 days before she died. He had found the letter in the archived correspondence file, a standard file that nobody had flagged because it had arrived after her death and had been logged as received and never actioned because the account manager at the time had been subsequently reassigned and nobody had followed up. The letter was short. It was written in a hurried hand that suggested she'd been frightened, or pressed for time, or both. It said, "If something happens to us, please ensure Harry's lordship is properly established before anyone, and I do mean anyone, takes guardianship decisions on his behalf. He is the Potter heir. His rights must be established first. Please. Please do this." Nagnok had read that letter 3 times. He looked at the hall. At the crowd. At the 3 men in expensive robes who were still not doing any banking. He thought about a mother who had known something was wrong and tried to protect her son through the one institution she thought might be trustworthy enough and independent enough to honor a request. He thought about the auditor's finding, 41 unauthorized accesses. The first one dated 7 weeks after Lily Potter's death. His hands, folded over each other, tightened slightly. They had failed Lily Potter. They had failed her son. They had failed because someone had forged authorization paperwork convincingly enough to pass the first-level checks and nobody had run the secondary logs for 22 years. The secondary logging system had been installed in 1989. It had sat there, quietly recording every override, for 6 years before Skerrick had looked at it. 6 years. The thought sat in Nagnok like a coal. Not burning, exactly. Just hot. Just present. He straightened and crossed the hall toward the 3 men in expensive robes, because watching them was less useful than talking to them, and talking to them was less useful than knowing who they were, and knowing who they were was the beginning of knowing what they were planning. He was a goblin, and he was very good at his job, and Ragnarok had just declared war, and it was going to be very important to know exactly who was on which side before the first real blow landed. He walked through the crowd of agitated wizards with the unhurried, absolute confidence of a person who owns the building. Because he did. Chapter 3, The boy who remembered the room they gave Harry at St. Mungo's was on the 5th floor, in a wing that didn't see much traffic. It had a window that looked out over London rooftops, a bed that was too soft after years of a cupboard cot, and a small shelf of books that a Medowitch had brought him without being asked, which told him she'd noticed him looking at the book trolley in the corridor. He'd been there 2 days. In those 2 days he had been visited by Amelia Bones twice, by a quiet wizard from the DMLE named Dawlish who took notes and said very little, by a healer specializing in magical trauma named Pomfrey, not the Hogwarts one, a different one, younger, who sat with him for an hour and asked questions that felt like they were about one thing but were actually about another, and by Healer Stroud, who came every morning ostensibly to check his vitals and actually, Harry had worked out, to make sure he was still there and still all right. He appreciated all of it. He also found it slightly exhausting in the way that being carefully managed was always exhausting once you noticed it was happening. He was not difficult about any of it. He answered questions when asked, ate the food they brought, slept at reasonable hours. He was cooperative in the full and genuine sense of the word, because he understood, with the particular clarity that had always been his, that he was only now starting to understand had been repeatedly taken from him and had grown back each time anyway, that cooperation was useful. That letting people feel they were helping was a form of letting them actually help. But in the hours between visits, in the long quiet stretches of London rooftop light and the soft sounds of the hospital around him, Harry was doing something else entirely. He was remembering. It had started the first night. He'd been lying in the too soft bed in the dark, listening to the building settle, when something had surfaced. Not a full memory, more like a shape of one. The feeling of standing in a garden, not Privet Drive's garden, somewhere else, somewhere with bigger trees, and knowing that the trees could hear him. Not in a frightening way. In a simple, factual way, the way you know that a door is wood or a window is glass. He'd sat up in bed and thought about it very carefully, the way you might prod at a loose tooth, not hard enough to hurt, just enough to understand the shape of the space it had left. The feeling had been warm. The memory, whatever it was warm. He could feel the texture of it even if he couldn't see it, the specific quality of being somewhere safe, of being someone who knew they were safe, not because nothing bad could happen but because you were held in something that wouldn't let you fall. He didn't know what that was. He was fairly certain he had once known exactly what that was, and that it had been taken. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought, 93 times. Not 93 memories. 93 wipes. Each wipe could have taken more than one thing. Each wipe had been targeted. Healer Stroud had used that word in the corridor, not knowing Harry was listening through the half-open door. Targeted. Not random erasure. Someone had looked at what Harry knew and chosen, deliberately, specifically, what to remove. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about what it meant that he had still grown back into himself anyway. That whatever they'd taken, they hadn't managed to take the thing that looked at the world and noticed it and catalogued it and drew conclusions. That core of him, whatever it was, had survived 93 rounds of deliberate reduction and was still here, intact, lying in a hospital bed, looking at the ceiling, working things out. That felt like something. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but it felt like something. Healer Pomfrey, her name was actually Isolde Pomfrey, and she had warm eyes and the slightly distracted quality of someone who is always thinking about 3 things at once, came on the 3rd morning with a different kind of energy than usual. She sat in the chair beside his bed, set her bag down, and instead of producing a notepad said, "I want to try something, if you're willing." "You don't have to say yes." "What kind of something?" Harry said. "A gentle memory restoration diagnostic. Not an active reversal. I can't do that yet, and honestly we wouldn't try it without a much longer preparation process and your full informed consent as your magical maturity develops. But what we can do is a light scan that maps what's missing. It doesn't recover anything. It just makes the outline visible. Like an X-ray showing where a bone healed wrong." She paused. "Sometimes people find it distressing to see the shape of what they've lost. Sometimes they find it clarifying. I don't know which it will be for you. What do you think it'll be for me?" Harry said. She considered that seriously, which he appreciated. "Clarifying," she said. "Then yes," Harry said. It was a simple charm. She cast it wandlessly, which surprised him, 2 fingers pressed lightly to his temple. He felt it as a kind of spreading warmth, like a blush but internal, moving through his skull and down into somewhere deeper. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the closest thing to comfortable he'd felt since walking into St. Mungo's, because it was warm in the same way the not-quite memory from the first night was warm. It lasted about 3 minutes. When it finished, Isolde Pomfrey took her fingers from his temple and was quiet for a moment, reading the diagnostic bloom that appeared briefly around his head, colors he couldn't see directly, visible only to the healer who'd cast the charm. She was quiet for long enough that Harry said, "What?" "I'm mapping it," she said. "Give me a moment." She mapped it. She wrote things down on a small piece of parchment with quick, efficient strokes. Then she put the parchment down and looked at Harry with the specific expression of a medical professional who has decided that honesty is more respectful than protection. "The wipes were targeted at 4 categories of memory," she said. "I can see the shapes, the outlines, like I said. The specific content is gone, but the pattern of what was taken is clear." "What 4 categories?" "Moments of accidental magic," she said. "Primarily the large ones, the ones that would have told you how powerful you are. Those are the most numerous category." She looked at her parchment. "Second, memories of connection. Times you felt genuinely cared for, or cared for someone else, or felt that you belonged somewhere. Third," she paused very briefly. "Third, any memory in which you learned something about your parents, your family, your history. Who they were. What happened to them. What you come from." Harry was looking at her steadily. "And the 4th? Moments of confidence," she said simply. "Times when you were certain of something. When you knew your own mind clearly. When you felt sure." The room was quiet. Harry thought about growing up in Privet Drive. About the specific texture of those years, the flinching, the smallness, the constant low-level uncertainty about whether he'd done something wrong even when he couldn't identify what. He'd always assumed that was just him. That he was a particularly uncertain sort of person. That confidence was a thing other people had. "They took the moments I knew I was sure," he said. "Yes. So I'd never know what being sure felt like. So you'd be easier to manage," she said quietly. "I think that was the goal." He looked at her for a moment. "But they grew back." She looked up from her parchment. "Sorry. The things they took. Not the memories, I understand those are gone. But the Whatever made me the kind of person who had those moments. That grew back. He said it not as a question but as an observation, testing it against the evidence. Every time they took it, it grew back. Isolde Pomfrey looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was not quite medical and not quite personal, the look of someone who is witnessing something that exceeds their framework and is choosing to simply witness it rather than categorize it. Yes, she said. It did. Because you can take a memory, Harry said, working it out as he spoke, but you can't take the thing in a person that generates the memory in the first place. You can't reach that deep. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. You can't. Harry nodded. He looked out the window at the rooftops. All right, he said. What do we do next? What they did next, that afternoon, was less pleasant. Amelia Bones came with a younger woman she introduced as Investigator Clearwater from the DMLE's Specialized Crimes Division, the division that handled magical crimes against minors. Clearwater was sharp-faced and efficient and had the practiced gentleness of someone whose job regularly required her to sit in rooms with children and ask them about things that had hurt them. They sat with Harry for 2 hours. He answered everything. He answered about the cupboard under the stairs, both the staying in it and the duration of it. He answered about the food. He answered about Dudley and the games Dudley and his friends played. He answered about the things he'd been told, about his parents, the car crash, the drunk driver, and the things he'd been told about himself, the things about being strange and wrong and a burden and something that needed to be managed. He answered all of it with the same steady, factual attention he'd brought to everything since he'd walked into this hospital. His voice didn't wobble. His hands rested quietly in his lap. He wasn't performing composure. He genuinely felt it, and what he'd worked out about that, lying awake, thinking, was that it wasn't numbness. It wasn't disconnection. It was the opposite. He was too clear-eyed about all of it to have space for the kind of falling apart that required you to still be surprised. He had worked out, lying in the dark with the sounds of London outside his window, that being surprised would require him to have expected something better. And he hadn't. And what was under that was not okay, he was not okay, exactly, he understood that, but it was solid. It was a foundation you could build on. When they finished, Clearwater looked at her notes and asked, in a neutral, careful voice, "Is there anything else you want us to know? Anything we haven't asked about?" Harry thought for a moment. The man who came to the house. Bones looked up. What man? Twice. Both times before I started school. A man with white hair and glasses, half-moon glasses, the kind that sit at the end of your nose. He came to the house and talked to my aunt. I wasn't supposed to see him, I think, because both times afterward I couldn't remember that he'd been there. But the memory of remembering is still there, like a shadow of it. He paused. Last night I was lying awake and I could feel the outline of it. The shape of him in the doorway and my aunt's face doing something I hadn't seen it do before. She was frightened of him. She didn't look frightened of many people, my aunt. But she was frightened of him. Bones was very still. You're certain? I'm certain I can feel the outline. I'm certain about my aunt's face. He looked at her. It's the same man who signed the vault authorizations, isn't it? It wasn't really a question. Bones answered it anyway. We believe so, she said. Yes. Harry nodded once. He looked at his hands, then back up. Can I ask you something? Yes. Is he going to try to come here? Bones met his gaze. He has already made a request through official channels to visit you, citing his position as your designated magical guardian under a document he filed in 1981. You denied it. I denied it. She paused. The document's legitimacy is currently under review, given the Gringotts declaration and its evidence regarding the forged authorizations. Another pause. For the moment, yes, I've denied access. But my ability to maintain that denial depends on the legal proceedings moving quickly, and legal proceedings in magical Britain do not always move quickly. Harry absorbed this. So I need to be ready for the possibility that he gets in. I'm working to ensure that doesn't happen. I know, Harry said. But I'd rather be ready for it anyway. Bones looked at him for a moment with an expression that was becoming familiar, the look she'd had in the examination room on the first day, the look of someone recalibrating. Yes, she said. I think being ready is a reasonable approach. The memory came back that night. Not a hint of one, not an outline, an actual memory, surfacing with the suddenness and completeness of something that had been held underwater finally breaking the surface. He was in a kitchen. Not Privet Drive's kitchen, brighter, warmer, with herb pots in the window and something bubbling on the stove that smelled of tomatoes and something else, something sweet. He was sitting on a high stool at the counter. He was small. Smaller than he was now. 3, maybe 4. There was a woman at the stove with red hair. She was laughing at something. He couldn't hear the sound of the laugh, the memory didn't have sound, or if it had it was gone, but he could see it in her shoulders, the way they lifted, the way she turned toward him mid-laugh and the laugh was still on her face and she reached out and ruffled his hair and her eyes were, he sat up in bed. He was breathing fast, which was new. The composure was still there, underneath, but his hands were shaking slightly and his chest had done something he couldn't fully describe, like a door he hadn't known was closed had been pushed open from the other side. His mother's eyes were green. He knew that. He'd been told that, once, he couldn't remember who by, some teacher maybe, some stranger. He'd filed it as a fact, a data point, something about his appearance that connected to something he'd never seen. He hadn't known what green looked like on her face. He sat in the dark for a long time with his hands in his lap, not shaking anymore, looking at the memory. Turning it over. Looking at every part of it. She'd ruffled his hair. Like it was a completely natural thing. Like he was, hers. He breathed out slowly. He thought about 93 instances. He thought about which category this memory fell into, moments of connection, times you felt genuinely cared for, and he thought about someone reaching deliberately into a 14-month-old child and removing the warmth of his mother's hands in his hair because it might make him too confident, too settled, too sure of himself. He thought about that for a long time. When the anger moved through him it was different from the clean, clarifying fury of the first day. This was slower and deeper and hotter and had a different texture, the particular quality of something that is not going to cool for a very long time. Not rage. Not the kind that made you break things or shout. The kind that made you very, very certain. He picked up the book he'd been reading from the shelf, an old magical history text that the Medowitch had included without commentary, possibly accidentally, possibly not, and read until it was light outside. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Healer Stroud came in the morning and found him sitting cross-legged on the bed with the history book open in his lap and an expression on his face that made her stop in the doorway. You remembered something, she said. My mother, Harry said. In a kitchen. Laughing at something. He looked up at her. How many of the 93 are likely to come back on their own? She came in and sat down. Honestly? We don't know. Targeted wipes are more stable than panic obliviations, they're more precisely executed, so they tend to hold. But there's a theory in the literature that wipes performed on children, whose magical cores are still developing, are inherently less stable than wipes performed on adults. The core grows around the gap rather than accepting it, and eventually the growth can push the wipe out. She paused. Like scar tissue rejecting a foreign body. So my magic was trying to fix it this whole time. It's possible. Yes. Harry was quiet for a moment. Will the ones that come back be complete? Or will they be like that, just pieces? It varies. Some will be fragmentary. Some may come back quite fully. It's not predictable. She looked at him carefully. How are you doing with this? He considered the question seriously because she'd asked it seriously. I'm angry, he said. Not in a way that gets in the way of thinking. Just, underneath everything else, there's this. He didn't try to describe it more precisely. She was a diagnostician, she'd understand imprecision as its own kind of data. She nodded slowly. That's healthy, she said. In the clinical sense, it's the appropriate emotional response to what you've been told. Okay, Harry said, with the slight dryness of a 7-year-old who has just been told that feeling furious is clinically appropriate. The corner of her mouth moved. Okay, she agreed. She checked his vitals, routine scan with her wand, the readout appearing in the air in front of her as a column of golden figures, and was making a note in his file when Harry said, without looking up from his book, Healer Stroud. When I was in the examination room, before you came back with Healer Ogilvy. The instrument was still running. Yes, she said, carefully. I could see the ribbon of parchment. The numbers at the top. He looked up. I could see 93 before you told me. I was letting you tell me in your own time. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said, and her voice did the small, complicated thing it sometimes did with him. I know you could. I just wanted you to know that I know, Harry said. That you handled it well. You were honest, and you went and got someone, and you called Amelia Bones instead of routing it through channels that might have swallowed it. You didn't have to do it that way. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. But I've seen what happens when things like this get managed instead of addressed. She closed his file with a soft, decisive sound. You deserved someone to make the right choice. He looked at her steadily. Thank you, he said. She left without saying anything else, which was the right response. The knock on his door at 2 in the afternoon was different from the usual sound of it, softer, more tentative, the knock of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome. Harry had been expecting someone like this. He hadn't known who. Come in, he said. The woman who opened the door was not Petunia. She was around Petunia's age, thin, with an exhausted look that was different from Petunia's particular brand of rigid tension. She was wearing Muggle clothes and carrying a handbag that she was holding in both hands in front of her, the handle turned over and over in her fingers. She was, Harry understood immediately, someone who had something to say and didn't know if she was allowed to say it. Harry, she said. He looked at her. My name is Arabella Figg, she said. You know me as your babysitter. Mrs. Figg from Wisteria Walk. You've spent a lot of time at my house over the years. He knew her. He had a functional memory of her, which meant whatever memories he had of Mrs. Figg had not been among the ones taken. Probably because time at Mrs. Figg's had been the Dursleys' version of punishment, boring, smelling of cats, a place you went when you weren't wanted. No one had thought to edit it. I know who you are, Harry said. Sit down if you want. She sat. She put the handbag in her lap. I'm a squib, she said. I have a small amount of magical awareness, not enough to do anything, but enough to sense it. Enough to have been asked. To keep watch. Who asked you? She looked at him. Her face was doing several things at once, none of them comfortable. Dumbledore, she said. He asked me to watch over you. Report if anything happened. I was told it was for your protection. That I was keeping you safe. Harry looked at her steadily and said nothing, because she wasn't finished. I should have, there were times. Things I saw. Things that didn't look right, even with me telling myself it was fine, it was temporary, he knew what he was doing. She was still turning the handbag handle over and over. I reported to him. Regularly. Twice a month. I told him about the cupboard, about the food, she stopped. I told him everything. He said it was manageable. That it would be addressed. That disrupting the arrangement would be worse for you. He said I needed to be humble, Harry said. Her hands went still on the handbag. He said that. I'm inferring it, Harry said. From the pattern. But I'm probably not wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. No, she said quietly. You're not wrong. Why are you here? Harry said. Not unkindly. As a genuine question. Because I spoke to Amelia Bones's office this morning and gave a full statement. Everything I reported to Dumbledore. Dates, details, all of it. She straightened slightly, the only thing in her bearing that came close to resolute. I know what I did. I know that watching and reporting and being told it was being handled is, I know that's not nothing. I know I'm part of this. She met his eyes. I wanted to tell you that myself. Before you found out from someone else. Because you deserved to hear it from the person who did it. Harry sat with that for a moment. He thought about years of Wisteria Walk and the smell of cats and cabinet biscuits going stale and Mrs. Fig's photographs of all her cats on the walls and the particular boredom of afternoons there, and he thought about the fact that all of it had been, not a babysitter. A surveillance post. Were you kind to me? He said. At your house. Were you kind? She looked startled. I tried to be. I was told to make it seem unpleasant, so you'd want to come home. I didn't always manage the unpleasant part. A pause. I let you read my books. The ones on the shelf in the sitting room. He remembered the books. A whole shelf of them, old hardcovers, a mix of fiction and history and one large encyclopedia of the natural world with illustrations. He'd worked through most of them over the years. That was you choosing to do that, he said. Yes. Okay, Harry said. I'm not going to tell you it's fine. It wasn't fine. But you came here and told me the truth yourself, and you gave a statement. That's the right thing. That counts. He paused. Not for everything. But it counts. Arabella Figg sat with her hands folded over her handbag and nodded once, small and precise, like someone accepting a verdict they'd expected but that still required a moment to absorb. That evening, Healer Stroud was at her desk finishing paperwork when her Fleur activated without a request chime. This meant either a senior hospital administrator or someone with a ministry override code. The face in the fire was Albus Dumbledore's. She stood up slowly. She did not move toward the Fleur. Healer Stroud, Dumbledore said. His voice was warm and measured and gave the impression of a conversation happening between two reasonable people in a reasonable situation. I wonder if I might have a moment. This is a restricted line, she said. You've used a ministry override code. I have various access permissions, yes. Accumulated over many years of working with the ministry on various matters. He smiled, the gentle, slightly rueful smile of a man who was very good at appearing to be in good humor under difficult circumstances. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm simply concerned about Harry. He's a child I've known and cared for since he was born. Whatever is being alleged, whatever investigation is underway, surely that doesn't preclude simple human concern. The custody restriction is in place, Stroud said. Director Bones has denied visitation access. That is not my decision to overturn or discuss. Of course. He tilted his head slightly. How is he? Can you tell me that much, at least? She looked at the face in her Fleur. The half-moon glasses. The long silver hair. The expression of warm, principled concern that was a very good expression, very well worn, very convincing. He is, she said, precisely and deliberately, recovering. Despite everything. She held his gaze. Which I think surprises some people. A brief silence. Good, Dumbledore said. I'm glad. The warmth in his voice was entirely intact. He's a remarkable child. He always has been. Whatever happens next, I hope people remember that above all. I do remember it, Stroud said. It's rather the basis of my objection to what was done to him. The warmth in his eyes didn't vanish. It just recalibrated. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift, like a compass needle moving a single degree. "I'll leave you to your evening," he said. "Thank you, Healer Stroud." The Fleur went dark. She stood in her office for a moment. Then she walked to her desk, picked up a quill, and wrote a note to Amelia Bones documenting the unauthorized Fleur contact and the exact wording of every exchange. She folded it, sealed it, and sent it by hospital messenger. Then she sat back down and returned to her paperwork, because there was a lot of it and it wasn't going to file itself, and she had learned a very long time ago that the best response to intimidation, subtle or otherwise, was to keep doing your job. Harry was at the window when the sun went down. London going amber and grey in the early evening, the rooftops catching the last light, pigeons doing their purposeless circuits above the chimney stacks. Another memory had come back. This one not warm, sharp and specific. He was 5, in the school playground, and he'd done something, climbed something, or jumped, or run, some physical thing, and the other children had stopped and looked, and Harry had felt, for one clear instant, the knowledge of his own capability. A clean, simple certainty: I can do this. I am fast and strong and good at this. And then, not nothing. The memory didn't stop. But there was a gap in it, like a stitch dropped in knitting, and on the other side of the gap he was standing at the edge of the playground feeling uncertain and small and looking at his feet. He pressed his hand against the window glass. It was cool, just starting to collect the evening's chill. He thought about the 4 categories. Moments of confidence. He thought about being 5 years old and knowing he was good at something and having that taken before it could settle. He thought about how many times. How many moments of "I can do this" had been carefully lifted out of him before they could become part of how he understood himself. He took his hand off the glass and looked at it. His ordinary, small, 7-year-old hand. He thought, 93 times I was reduced and I grew back every single time. He thought, they will not get a 94th. He pressed the certainty of that into himself like a thumb pressing a seal into wax, making it permanent, making it set. Behind him, on the shelf, the book on magical history sat with its spine turned out, and one of the chapters he'd read twice now was titled Goblin Financial Law and the Rights of Magical Lordship, and he had found it informative in ways that the hospital probably hadn't anticipated when they'd included it. He was 7 years old. He had 93 stolen moments and a fury that wasn't going anywhere and a mind that had survived everything anyone had tried to do to it. Outside the window, London moved through its evening routines, indifferent and vast. Harry looked at it and felt, rising in him with the quietness of something that has been there all along waiting to be recognized, the specific, absolute certainty of someone who has decided exactly who they are and what they intend. He turned away from the window. He picked up the history book. He started the chapter on Goblin War declarations again from the beginning, because the first time through had been familiarization and the second time was for detail, and detail was going to matter. Chapter 4, The Old Man's Chest. Dumbledore moved on a Thursday. It wasn't dramatic. It never was, with him. That was the thing about the way he operated that Harry had been piecing together from conversations, from Arabella Figg's statement, from the shape of decisions made over 22 years of audited vault records. He didn't crash through things. He arranged them. He placed pieces so carefully and so far in advance that by the time anyone noticed the arrangement, the game was already in its final stages. Thursday morning, 3 things happened within an hour of each other. The first was that the Gringotts Administrative Office received a formal petition, signed by 17 of its 82 members, requesting an emergency session to review the legal validity of St. Mungo's protective custody invocation on Harry Potter, on the grounds that the custody decision had been made unilaterally by the DMLE without full Gringotts oversight, which a reading of the Magical Minors Act, a specific, narrow, technically accurate reading, suggested was procedurally irregular. The second was that the Daily Prophet ran a front-page story headlined "Boy WHO Lived in Hospital, Ministry Overreach or Necessary Protection?", which managed, in 3 carefully worded paragraphs, to introduce the phrase, "some legal scholars question," 4 times without naming a single legal scholar, and to note that sources close to the Hogwarts administration had expressed concern about the boys' well-being and access to appropriate guidance. The third was that Cornelius Fudge, who had spent 3 days performing shocked outrage and cooperative helpfulness with the energy of a man who has been told very clearly what his lines are, quietly authorized a procedural review of Director Bones's Section 7 invocation, citing the need to ensure all ministry protocols had been properly followed. Harry read about the first and second things in the morning paper, which the Medowitch brought with his breakfast without comment. He read it twice. Then he folded it neatly and put it on the bedside table and ate his toast. Healer Stroud told him about the third thing when she came in at 9. Fudge authorized a procedural review, she said, without preamble, which he appreciated. It doesn't affect your immediate custody, but it creates a legal avenue for challenging the restriction order. If the challenge succeeds, access restrictions could be loosened. He could get in, Harry said. It's possible. Bones is already filing counterdocumentation. She paused. She wanted me to tell you. She didn't want you finding out from someone else. Tell her thank you, Harry said. And tell her I'd like to speak with her today, if she has time. Stroud looked at him for a moment. I'll pass that on. She left. Harry looked at the folded newspaper on the bedside table. He looked at it for a while, thinking about the phrase sources close to the Hogwarts administration and the shape of what it meant that 3 separate things had happened within an hour of each other, none of them obviously connected, all of them pointing in the same direction. He picked up the newspaper and read it a third time. This time he was reading for what it didn't say, the gaps, the careful omissions, the things that a story framed this way would lead a reader not to think about. It didn't mention the Gringotts declaration. Not once. He put the paper down. Someone had convinced the prophet that the Gringotts declaration wasn't the story. That the story was the ministry's procedural overreach. That the question worth asking was whether Harry Potter was being protected or being used. It was good. He had to give it that. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it was genuinely good, sympathetic to Harry in a surface way while subtly reframing the investigation as the problem rather than the crime that had prompted it. He thought about the man who had stood in Petunia Dursley's doorway. Who had been worth being frightened of. Yes, he thought. I'll need to be ready. Amelia Bones arrived at 11. She came with investigator Clearwater and a third person Harry hadn't met, a short, compact witch named Griselda Marchbanks, who was introduced as a Wisengamot elder and who looked at Harry with the sharp-eyed attention of someone who has been in enough rooms with enough powerful people to recognize the quality of a person quickly and accurately. They sat. Harry looked at Bones. The petition, he said. 17 members. Who are they? Bones produced a list. She'd apparently anticipated this question. Harry read through it, names that meant little to him individually but which, taken together, told a story about which families had interests in the current arrangement continuing. Not, he said. Flint. Parkinson. He looked up. 3 of those are families that received redirected funds from the Potter Vault. The audit lists them. A brief silence. Yes, Bones said. We noticed. So the petition is being filed partly by people who have a direct financial interest in the investigation not proceeding, Harry said. Can that be challenged? Conflict of interest? Griselda Marchbanks made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the involuntary acknowledgement of a good point. It can, she said. It's not a simple challenge, procedurally, but it has precedent. She was looking at Harry with that sharp-eyed quality intensified. Are you asking me to file it? I'm asking if it's possible, Harry said. I don't know enough about Wisengamot procedure to know if it's the right move or if there's a better one. Honest answer, Marchbanks said. I'm 7, Harry said. I have a lot of gaps. The corner of her mouth moved. The conflict of interest challenge is possible. Filed alongside a counter-petition requesting the session itself be expanded in scope, not just reviewing the custody invocation, but reviewing the entirety of the circumstances that led to it. She tilted her head slightly. If we go into that session talking only about procedure, they've already won the framing. If we go in talking about why the boy is in protective custody in the first place, the framing reverses. But we need to be ready for the session to actually happen quickly, Clearwater said. If they push for an early date, then we're ready, Bones said. She looked at Harry. What you need to understand is that this session, if it happens, will not be private. Wisengamot emergency sessions are a matter of record. The full membership will be present. That's 82 people, some of whom are actively hostile to this investigation and several of whom are almost certainly in communication with Dumbledore. And Dumbledore himself, Marchbanks said. As Chief Warlock, he presides. The room was quiet for a moment. He presides over the session that's reviewing the investigation into him, Harry said. He is not formally under investigation, Bones said carefully. The DMLE has opened a file. Evidence is being compiled. Until charges are formally brought, his position as Chief Warlock is legally intact. So he gets to chair his own inquiry. In practical terms, yes. Harry looked at the window. The London rooftops. He thought about chess. He'd taught himself from a book at Privet Drive, playing both sides, which had taught him something that playing against an opponent didn't always teach, that you could understand a strategy completely and still lose to it if the other player had more pieces in motion. He'll be reasonable, Harry said. In the session. He'll be kind and measured and very sad about everything, and he'll frame it as being about his concern for me. He won't be defensive. He'll be paternal. Bones was looking at him steadily. That's an accurate prediction. It'll work on some of them, Harry said. Probably most of them. He's had a long time to build those relationships. He paused. What we need is something he can't be reasonable about. Something that's just numbers. Evidence that doesn't need to be interpreted. Marchbanks leaned forward slightly. The Gringotts authentication, she said. Triple-signed Goblin audit documentation is admissible in Wisengamot proceedings under the 1867 Accord. It doesn't require interpretation. It's a record of what happened. Can we submit it to the session record before it convenes? Harry said. So every member has it in front of them when they walk in? That would require, Clearwater started. A filing through the Wisengamot clerk's office, Marchbanks finished. Which I have the authority to initiate. She sat back. It would need to be done within 48 hours of the session date being confirmed. Then we need to know the session date as soon as possible, Harry said. He looked at Bones. Can you find out who's pushing for early scheduling and how early they're pushing? Already working on it, Bones said. He looked at each of them in turn. I want to attend, he said. The session. If it happens. Bones opened her mouth. I know, Harry said. I'm 7. I'm in protective custody. It's complicated. He met her gaze. But if I'm not there, the session is about a boy in a hospital bed who has no voice in his own situation. If I'm there, it's different. It's also a significant risk, Clearwater said. Exposure, politically, I know the risk, Harry said. I'm still saying I want to attend. Griselda Marchbanks was watching him with an expression that had moved fully beyond the professional and into something more personal, the look of a woman who has spent 60 years in rooms where people argued about power and has developed a very specific kind of respect for the unusual. He has legal standing, she said. Under the Magical Minors Act, a child who is the subject of a protective custody review has the right to be present at proceedings that concern their welfare. It would need to be argued, then argue it, Harry said. A pause. Right, Marchbanks said, and picked up her quill. In the afternoon, Dumbledore walked into the Ministry of Magic and straight to Fudge's office without an appointment. This was not unusual. In 20 years, Albus Dumbledore had never needed an appointment with a sitting minister for magic, and the 4 ministers who had held office in that span had all found it easier to accept this than to attempt changing it. Fudge's secretary tried anyway. Dumbledore smiled at her warmly and walked past. Fudge was at his desk with 3 pieces of parchment and the expression of a man who has been hoping to avoid this conversation. "Albus," he said. "Cornelius." Dumbledore sat down without being invited, crossed one leg over the other, and folded his hands with the relaxed ease of a man paying a social call. "Thank you for authorizing the procedural review." "I'm not, that is, it was a purely procedural matter," Fudge said. "Due diligence. Standard oversight." "Of course," Dumbledore agreed. "I'm not suggesting otherwise." He paused. "How are things moving?" Fudge shifted in his chair. "The DMLE is, Bones is being Bones. She's counterfiling. The session request is being formalized, I expect a date within the week." "Good." Dumbledore's tone suggested they were discussing a Quidditch match schedule. "And the Gringotts matter?" "Legal is still," Fudge stopped. He was a politician and he had survived as long as he had by being sensitive to the quality of the air in a room. The quality of this air was telling him something. "Albus. I have to be honest with you." "Please," Dumbledore said warmly. "The declaration, the financial record, those are authenticated documents. I can slow things down, I can buy time, I can make the procedural pathways longer. But I cannot make 207 pages of goblin audit documentation disappear." He leaned forward. "What do you need me to do, exactly?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The warmth was still there but something behind it had shifted into a different register, the warmth of a teacher who has been patient and is still being patient but has noted that the lesson needs restating. "I need the boy in the right hands," he said. "Protective custody at St. Mungo's with Amelia Bones controlling access is not the right hands. Harry needs to be with people who understand his situation, his significance. People who can prepare him properly." "You mean you," Fudge said, more directly than he usually managed. "I mean the people I trust to do what's best for him," Dumbledore said, which was not a yes and not a no and functioned as both simultaneously. Fudge looked at his desk. He thought about the declaration. He thought about what Umbridge had said about distance, about association. He thought about 207 pages of authenticated financial records that he genuinely could not make disappear. "I need to think about this," he said. "Of course," Dumbledore said. He stood, unhurried. "I have every confidence in your judgment, Cornelius. You've always understood what matters." He left. Fudge sat at his desk and looked at the closed door and thought that being told you understood what mattered, by someone who had just told you what to think, was a very odd sort of compliment. He reached for his quill and then put it down and reached for his Fleur powder instead, because what he needed right now was not to write anything down. Umbridge caught the Fleur conversation on the Ministry's internal monitoring system, which she had quietly had access to for 3 years, and which Fudge did not know about. She sat in her own office, pink, frilly, aggressively cheerful in its decor in a way that functioned as a kind of aggressive camouflage, and listened to Fudge's call and thought about sides. The current configuration of sides was, Dumbledore on one side, the investigation on the other, and Fudge somewhere in the middle trying to be on both simultaneously, which was a position with a very short operational lifespan. Umbridge thought about what happened to people who were on Dumbledore's side when Dumbledore's position became untenable. She thought about 207 pages of authenticated financial records that were going to be, whatever else happened, a matter of permanent public record. She thought about Harry Potter, who was 7 years old and sitting in a hospital room and apparently conducting himself in a way that had made Amelia Bones, who was famously unsurprisable, revise her assessment of the situation multiple times in 4 days. She picked up a quill and began writing a letter to Amelia Bones. It was not an official letter. It had no ministry heading. It was written from Dolores Umbridge personally, on plain parchment, and it contained 3 pieces of information about the internal ministry communications of the last 72 hours that Bones would find very useful. She sealed it, charmed it to open only for Bones, and sent it by private owl. Then she tidied her desk and went back to her other work, because Dolores Umbridge was many things but she was not, when the situation clearly required adaptation, inflexible. Bones got the letter at 4 in the afternoon and read it twice, because the first time through she was too surprised to fully absorb it. Then she sat at her desk and thought about it for 5 minutes. Then she went to St. Mungo's. Harry was reading when she came in. He set the book down and looked at her and apparently read whatever was in her expression because he said, before she'd said anything, something changed. "I got some information I wasn't expecting," she said. "From a source I wasn't expecting." She sat down. "There's a Ministry Communication Oversight Committee, it's not widely known. Someone has been monitoring internal Fleur calls." She paused. "Dumbledore visited Fudge this afternoon. I have a summary of what was said." Harry looked at her. "Waited. He wants you moved. Out of St. Mungo's custody and into the hands of people he chooses. He's using Fudge as the lever, asking him to create the procedural pathway." She paused. "Fudge said he needed to think about it. Based on the source's assessment, that means he'll probably do it but he'll wait until it can be framed as following correct process." "How long do we have?" Harry said. "The procedural review Fudge authorized could generate an order within a week. Maybe less." She looked at him directly. "I want to be honest with you about how hard it is to defend a position when the person you're defending it against controls a significant portion of the formal process." "He's got 17 Wizengamot members," Harry said. "He's got the Chief Warlock chair. He's got Fudge, sort of. He's got the Prophet." He paused. "What have we got?" "Gringotts," Bones said. "Yes," Harry said. "The authentication documentation is airtight. It's the strongest piece of evidence we have, possibly the strongest piece of evidence I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement." She paused. "The problem is that the Wizengamot session is controlled by Dumbledore's chair. He can limit what's submitted, he can control the order of proceedings, he can, not if there's a conflict of interest challenge already on the record," Harry said. "Marchbanks is filing it. If the challenge is successful, he can't chair the session. Someone else gets the chair." Bones looked at him. "Who chairs in his absence?" "The Deputy Chief Warlock," Harry said. "I looked it up this afternoon." He held up the book. It was a constitutional guide to Wizengamot procedure that he'd asked the Medowitch to find him. "Augusta Longbottom." A pause. "Augusta Longbottom is not one of Dumbledore's people," Bones said slowly. "No," Harry said. "She's not." Bones was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been working on this?" "Since this morning," Harry said. "When I read the paper and realized the framing was already being set." He paused. "I'm not trying to run the strategy. I know I don't have enough information. But I can see the shape of it, and I can look things up, and I thought you should have the pieces even if I'm not the right person to put them together." Bones looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not quite the recalibrating look. This was something past recalibration. This was someone arriving at a settled assessment. "I'm going to contact Augusta Longbottom tonight," she said. "And I'm going to reach out to Gringotts directly. Not through the official liaison, directly. To their war council." Harry straightened slightly. "They'll want to talk to me," he said. "Gringotts. At some point." "I know," Bones said. "We're going to need to manage the timing carefully. Getting you out of St. Mungo's and into Gringotts before Fudge's procedural review generates an order, is that possible?" Harry said. "Technically," she said slowly, "if Gringotts makes a formal request for a meeting with Lord Potter, using that title, under the terms of the Potter family charter, then the request carries the legal weight of a treaty obligation. Specifically the 1867 Accord, which requires that magical Britain facilitate the ability of Gringotts to conduct business with its account holders without interference. She paused. That would create a window. A legal justification for transport that Fudge's review couldn't easily block, because blocking it would mean breaching the 1867 Accord, which is already under strain because of the war declaration, Harry said. Breaching it further would escalate. Exactly. Harry thought for a moment. Then the timing matters. We need the Gringotts request filed before Fudge's review generates an order. And we need the conflict of interest challenge filed at the same time so Dumbledore can't move to block the Gringotts meeting through the Wizengamot. We need all three things happening simultaneously, Bones said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need about 12 hours to set this up. Then set it up, Harry said. You understand, Bones said carefully, that once this moves, it moves fast. There's no managed, gentle progression through this. The Wizengamot session, the Gringotts meeting, the formal lodging of evidence, it all happens in a very compressed timeline. Good, Harry said, with a directness that left no room for misinterpretation. I've had 7 years of things being managed. I'd like things to move fast. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not the recalibration, something different. The look of someone recognizing a quality they'd thought was rarer than it apparently was. All right, she said. Fast it is. Dumbledore came at 8 in the evening. Harry was at the window when he heard the door, and he knew from the particular quality of the knock, firm, warm, the knock of someone who considers themselves a welcome presence, before he turned around. The door opened before Harry said come in. That was the first thing. He was tall. Harry had known this from the outline memory of the doorway, but knowing and seeing were different things. He was tall and old, and his robes were a deep midnight blue, and his half-moon glasses caught the room's light as he came through the door, and his face had the expression of a grandfather, warm, concerned, slightly sorrowful in the way of someone who carries many things but carries them gracefully. He looked at Harry and his face did something genuine, Harry thought. Not performed. Whatever Dumbledore felt when he looked at Harry Potter, some of it was real. That was the most complicated part. Harry, he said. His voice was like his expression, warm, carrying, the voice of a man who had learned how to fill rooms with himself without appearing to try. I'm so glad you're all right. How did you get in? Harry said. A small pause. I have some access permissions. Bones denied your access request, Harry said. She told me herself. How did you get in? Dumbledore moved further into the room. He did it the way he did everything, without apparent strategy, as if he simply moved through space and happened to end up in particular places. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Harry with the warmth still entirely intact. You've grown into quite a remarkable young man, he said. I knew you would. I'm 7, Harry said. And you haven't answered the question. Fudge's procedural review created a temporary gap in the restriction order, Dumbledore said, with the honest ease of a man who doesn't bother lying about logistics. It won't last long. I wanted to see you. He paused. I wanted to speak with you before others spoke for me. Others haven't spoken for you, Harry said. There's a financial record. That speaks for itself. Ah. Dumbledore looked at him carefully. You've been told about the audit findings. Yes. I see. He sat down in the chair without being invited. Harry stayed standing, because standing put him at an immediate disadvantage of height, and he refused to compound it by being seated as well. Dumbledore looked up at him with that sorrowful warmth, that expression of a man who is about to tell you a difficult truth lovingly. Harry, there are things about your situation that are complex. That require an understanding of events that you don't yet have. The decisions that were made, the ones that are being characterized as theft, as misconduct, were made with your well-being and safety as the absolute priority. The vault accesses, Harry said. 41 of them. Authenticated by Gringotts. Those were for my well-being. The resources were used in service of the broader effort to protect you and to prepare the magical world for what is coming, Dumbledore said. His voice was gentle and completely certain. The certainty was the most interesting part, not defensive, not explaining itself. Just certain. That effort required resources, and your family's vault is one of the most substantial in Britain, and your parents, had they lived, would have understood. They didn't live, Harry said. A pause. No, Dumbledore said softly. They didn't. And there will, Harry said, which Gringotts has on record, designated specific guardians who weren't the Dursleys. Which you also overrode. He looked at Dumbledore directly. You decided you knew better than my parents what was good for me. I decided, Dumbledore said, with a patient, sad firmness, that what was good for you in the short term, comfort, knowledge, safety, was less important than what was necessary for you in the long term. He met Harry's gaze. I made hard choices. I have made many hard choices over a long life. I will not apologize for choosing your survival. My survival, Harry said. You took memories from me 93 times. I did not personally. Your signature is on 11 of them, Harry said. Gringotts has the diagnostic data from St. Mungo's. Your signature. He paused. What were you taking? The 11th time, say. What memory of mine were you deciding I didn't need? The warmth didn't leave Dumbledore's face, but something around it changed, a slight tightening, a minute recalibration. He looked at Harry the way a chess player looks at a board that has just produced an unexpected position. I was managing information, Dumbledore said. Ensuring that you didn't become aware of your significance, your power, your status, before you had the maturity and the context to handle it responsibly. You were making me small, Harry said. So I'd be easier to manage. I was keeping you safe, Dumbledore said, and the warmth was still there, but it had taken on an edge. Not anger, something more like the quality of a man who is very tired of being misunderstood. You don't understand what you are, Harry. What you mean? The forces that are still in motion that you will be required to face. If you had grown up knowing your power, your fame, your wealth, your status, you would have arrived at Hogwarts impossible to guide. Impossible to manage, Harry said again. Dumbledore looked at him. That's the word you keep coming back to, Harry said. That's what it's actually about. Not my safety. Not the forces in motion, whatever those are. You needed me manageable. That's what the memory wipes were for. That's what the Dursleys were for. Keep him small, keep him uncertain, keep him grateful for scraps, and when you need him he'll follow you because he won't know how to do anything else. The room was very quiet. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter, 7 years old, too small for the room, green eyes absolutely steady, and what moved across his face was something complicated and genuine and not entirely comfortable to look at. Not guilt, exactly. The expression of a man who has looked at a map so long that he has stopped questioning whether it's accurate and who is now faced with the possibility that it isn't. You're a child, he said, softly. Yes, Harry said. That you made smaller on purpose. Several times. He held Dumbledore's gaze. I know what you're here to do. You want to talk to me before anyone else can, because you've decided that if you can establish a relationship directly, if you can be warm and sad and convince me that you made hard choices for good reasons, I'll be less certain. I'll start wondering if maybe you were right. I'll be 7 years old talking to a very powerful man who knew my parents and who seems to genuinely care, and I'll feel the pull of that. He paused. I feel it. I want you to know that. It's there. Dumbledore was very still. And it doesn't change anything, Harry said. Because caring about someone and doing harm to them aren't opposites. You can do both at once. You did. The silence stretched. Outside, London continued its evening. The hospital hummed around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a healer's shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. Then he stood. He moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "I have made mistakes," he said, and his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the warmth as instrument quality, something more raw underneath. "Perhaps more than I've acknowledged. Perhaps ones I'm not yet fully able to see." He paused. "But the threat that's coming is real, Harry. Whatever else is true, that is true. And I hope that when it arrives, you'll remember that not everything I did was done cynically." He left. Harry stood in the quiet room and breathed steadily and waited until he was certain Dumbledore was gone. Then he sat down on the bed. He put his hands on his knees. He breathed. The pull was still there, the complicated, real thing of a powerful person's genuine feeling. He'd been honest about that. He felt it. He also felt the 93. And his mother's hands in his hair. And the playground memory and the dropped stitch in it. And the cold kitchen counter at Privet Drive and the sound of Dudley claiming the chairs. He picked up the Wisengamot procedure book and found the page on conflict of interest challenges and reread it carefully, making small notes in the margin with the pencil the Medowitch had brought him. He was 7 years old. He had just told Albus Dumbledore exactly what he was doing and why, to his face, without flinching once. He felt okay about that. He felt, if he was being precise about it, quite good about that. He kept reading. 3 floors down, in the stairwell, Dumbledore stood alone for a moment with one hand on the stone railing. He thought about a boy in a hospital room with steady green eyes and his mother's face and the capacity to name, accurately and without drama, exactly what was being done to him. He thought about Lily Potter, who had always been the sharpest person in any room, and who had apparently managed to pass that quality along through whatever alchemy made a person who they are. He thought about whether he had, perhaps, miscalculated. The thought was uncomfortable and he was not accustomed to uncomfortable thoughts about his own judgment. He had 40 years of practice at finding the framing that made his decisions coherent and necessary. He descended the stairs and went out into the London night, and he was already, as he walked, finding new framings, new arrangements, new ways to make the necessary moves. The chess game had changed. The opponent was smaller than expected and considerably more dangerous. He would adapt. He had always adapted. But something small and uncharacteristically honest whispered, as he disapparated into the dark, that the boy in the hospital room had not looked like a piece that could be managed. He had looked like a player. Chapter 5, War Terms. The Gringotts' formal request arrived at St. Mungo's at 6 in the morning. It came by armored owl, an actual armored owl, mail-clad in articulated bronze plates that caught the early light coming through the 5th-floor window, the kind of delivery that Gringotts reserved for communications that were simultaneously legal documents, treaty invocations, and unmistakable statements of intent. The letter itself was sealed in red wax stamped with the Gringotts crest and addressed in precise, formal script to Lord Harry James Potter, heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter, account holder in good standing at Gringotts Bank of Diagon Alley. The Medowitch who received it looked at it for a long moment. Then she went and woke Healer Stroud. Stroud read it, recognized what it was, and immediately fled Amelia Bones. By 6:30, Bones was at the hospital. By 7, the Gringotts' request had been formally logged with the Ministry under the 1867 Accords notification requirements, which meant the Ministry had been officially informed that Gringotts was invoking treaty rights to meet with its account holder and that any interference with that meeting would constitute a treaty breach, and the Ministry had 48 hours to formally object, after which the meeting was considered legally protected regardless of any domestic custody orders. At 7:15, Bones brought the letter to Harry. He was already awake. He'd slept 4 hours and read for 3 and was sitting at the window eating toast when she came in. He read the letter. He read it again. He set it down on his knee. "Lord Potter," he said. "It's what the Charter calls you," Bones said. "Under their law and under the terms of the Charter itself, the title accrued at your 7th birthday. Gringotts has been legally required to acknowledge it since then. The fact that they didn't until now, is part of the problem, Harry said. Yes. He looked at the letter. They want to meet today. They've requested this afternoon. 2 o'clock, at Gringotts. She paused. It's aggressive timing. Deliberately so. They're using the 48-hour notification window to create a protected corridor before Fudge's procedural review can generate any orders. Dumbledore broke through the restriction order last night, Harry said. Fudge's review created a gap. Did you close it? I filed an emergency injunction at midnight, Bones said. It holds through the weekend. But the conflict of interest challenge, Marchbanks filed it this morning as well. The Wisengamot clerk has formally received it. So right now, Harry said, there are 3 things in motion simultaneously. The Gringotts treaty request, the conflict of interest challenge, and the injunction on the restriction order. He looked up at her. And Dumbledore knows all of this. By now, almost certainly. What's he going to do? Bones was quiet for a moment. He can't block the Gringotts meeting without breaching the 1867 Accord, which is already under pressure from the war declaration. He can't block the conflict of interest challenge because Marchbanks filed it independently and she has standing. The injunction is on record. She paused. He can try to accelerate his own timeline. Push for the Wisengamot session before the challenge is ruled on. Can he do that? As Chief Warlock, he sets the session schedule. Technically yes. Harry thought about that. Then we need Augusta Longbottom ready to assume the chair the moment the conflict of interest ruling comes through. She's been briefed, Bones said. She's ready. Harry nodded. He looked at the letter in his lap. The formal script, the bronze wax seal, the weight of it. Lord Harry James Potter. He was 7 years old in a hospital gown and he was about to walk into Gringotts Bank and sit across from whoever had declared war on magical Britain. I need proper clothes, he said. Bones blinked. Then something moved across her face that was, briefly and involuntarily, close to a smile. I'll see to it, she said. The clothes arrived at noon, proper wizarding robes, deep charcoal gray with silver fastenings, sized correctly for a 7-year-old and cut without any of the softening roundness that children's robes usually had. No decoration, no unnecessary embellishment. Just clean, well-made, serious fabric that said exactly nothing except that the person wearing it had considered the occasion. Bones had chosen well. Harry put them on and looked at himself in the narrow mirror on the back of the bathroom door. He looked small. He was still small, there was no getting around that. He was 7 and he was slight and his hair did the thing it always did, which was refuse to cooperate with any arrangement he tried to impose on it. He looked small, and he looked absolutely sure of himself, and those 2 things together made for an interesting combination. He turned away from the mirror. Healer Stroud was in the corridor when he came out. She looked at him for a moment, that complicated look she'd been doing since the first day, the one that was professional and personal at once, and then she said, "Ready?" "Yes," Harry said. She walked with him to the lift. Bones was waiting in the lobby with Clearwater and 2 DMLE officers in plain clothes. There was a ministry car outside, not the flashy kind, the functional kind, which was the right call. As they walked through the lobby, Harry passed the 3rd floor waiting area. He looked through the glass window at the pastel walls and the moving prints and the chairs, at the specific chair he'd sat in 5 days ago, too big for him, watching the stars rearrange themselves into patterns. He thought, 5 days. He turned away and kept walking. Diagon Alley in the morning was busy in the way of a place that doesn't know yet how much things have changed. Witches and wizards going about their business, the apothecary, and the bookshop and Ollivanders and the Owl Emporium all operating normally, and above it all the white marble face of Gringotts at the end of the alley gleaming in the July sun like something that had decided a long time ago not to be impressed by anything and had maintained this position consistently ever since. There were more goblins visible than usual. At the main entrance, flanking the bronze doors on the outside, which normally only had the standard door guards, there were 6 additional goblins in ceremonial armor, short and still and absolutely formidable in the way of guards who are there to make a statement as much as provide security. The statement was visible from halfway down the alley. People were noticing. There were clusters of witches and wizards stopped at a respectful distance, watching the entrance, talking in low voices. Harry walked up the steps without slowing. The guards watched him approach. One of them, slightly taller than the rest, with a ceremonial spear that caught the sun, looked at Harry with the flat, assessing attention of someone deciding something rapidly. Then, with a precision that suggested it had been choreographed but was nonetheless entirely genuine, all 6 guards brought their spears upright in formal salute. For a 7-year-old who had spent his life being told he was a burden, it was something. He kept his face neutral and inclined his head slightly, which felt right without him having thought about it, and walked through the bronze doors. The main banking hall was quieter than usual. Not empty. Gringotts was never empty during business hours, but the normal crowd had thinned, and the tellers at their high counters were working with a different quality of attention than usual. More alert. Several of them tracked Harry's progress across the hall without being obvious about it. A goblin was waiting at the far end of the hall beside a door Harry had never seen open before. He was younger than Harry had expected, not young, no goblin was young exactly, but younger than the ancient, grizzled figure Harry had been building in his imagination. He was lean with a long face and dark eyes that were doing the same assessing rapidly thing the door guard had done, except more thoroughly, and the assessment was complete before Harry had crossed half the hall. "Lord Potter," the goblin said. His voice was precise and entirely without the performative deference that Harry had noticed some adults used, which was its own form of condescension. This was professional address. Level address. "I am Nagnok, second to War Chief Ragnok. I'll be your primary contact today and going forward, pending your preferences." "Harry is fine," Harry said. "Lord Potter is accurate," Nagnok said. "Not rudely. Simply as a matter of fact. The title isn't about ceremony. It has legal and treaty weight that matters today specifically." Harry considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. "Lord Potter today." "Good." Nagnok turned to the door. "The war chief is waiting. I'll brief you as we walk on what to expect." They went through the door and into a corridor that was nothing like the main hall. The marble gave way to dressed stone, the bright chandeliers to the cool phosphorescent light Harry had read about in the history books. It was the deep light of underground places, clean and slightly blue, and it suited the corridor in the way that candlelight suited old stone. Nagnok walked at Harry's pace without making it obvious he was adjusting. "Ragnok will address you formally first," he said. "Protocol. Don't rush it. When he invites you to speak, speak directly. He respects directness. He has very little patience for people who use many words to say small things." "What does he want from this meeting?" Harry said. Nagnok glanced at him sideways. "Several things. Your acknowledgement of your lordship under goblin law. Your understanding of the declaration and the grounds for it." He paused. "And he wants to know what you want." "What I want from the war," Harry said. "What you want, full stop. The war is one aspect." They turned a corner, the corridor widening slightly, the stone warmer in color, older looking. "Gringotts failed you. Ragnok will acknowledge that. He will do it once, plainly, and then move on because dwelling on it serves neither of you. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it happens." "You read the St. Mungo's report," Harry said. "Thoroughly," Nagnok said. "And my mother's letter," Harry said. He'd worked this out 2 nights ago. She wrote to Gringotts before she died. I think I know what she said." Nagnok was quiet for 3 steps. "Yes," he said. "She did. She asked you to establish my lordship before anyone made guardianship decisions on my behalf." "Yes. And it didn't happen because the letter arrived after her death and wasn't actioned." "Correct." Harry was quiet for a moment. She knew, he said. She knew something was going to happen and she tried to protect me through you because she thought you were independent enough to actually do it. He paused. That must have been significant, Nagnok said, and the word carried something in it that wasn't professional. Brief. Controlled. But there. Harry nodded once. He filed it. He kept walking. The door at the end of the corridor was black stone, the same vein as the walls, seamless enough that it was barely visible until Nagnok pressed his palm to a section of wall and it swung inward without sound. The Chamber of Reckoning was not what Harry had expected and was exactly what it should have been. He understood this contradictory impression immediately upon entering. His mental image of goblin formality had been shaped by wizarding descriptions, which tended toward either dismissive or fearful, and which had given him something either too shabby or too imposing. The reality was neither. The room was serious. That was the word. The stone table, the phosphorescent walls, the 14 chairs arranged around it, all of it had the quality of a place where serious things happened and which had been designed with serious things in mind, nothing wasted, nothing decorative, every element functional and chosen. 12 of the 14 chairs were occupied. Goblins in formal attire, not ceremonial armor, not banking uniforms, something in between, the clothing of people who operated in a space where diplomacy and warfare were two expressions of the same intent. At the head of the table, Ragnarok. He was old. The good kind of old, the kind that meant accumulated rather than diminished. He sat in his chair with the stillness of something geological, and his eyes, dark and level, tracked Harry's progress from the door to the table with the attention of a person who has been waiting for this particular thing for a specific reason. Harry walked to the chair at the opposite end of the table, the only empty chair, obviously placed for him, and sat down. He didn't wait to be invited. He sat down and looked at Ragnarok directly, and Ragnarok looked back at him, and for a moment the room was simply two people taking the measure of each other across a stone table. Then Ragnarok spoke. His voice was deep and measured and had the quality of something that had been used to say important things for a very long time. Lord Harry James Potter. Heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter. Account holder at Gringotts Bank under the terms of the Potter family charter, dated 1243. A pause. You are acknowledged in this chamber. Thank you, Harry said. Gringotts failed in its obligation to you, Ragnarok said. Nagnok had been right, it was plain, direct, and then it was done. Your mother requested specific protections in a letter received after her death. The letter was not actioned. The vault charter was not invoked. 41 unauthorized accesses occurred over 22 years. These failures are acknowledged and are part of the grounds for the declaration. I understand, Harry said. The declaration has been filed with the ICW. It has been delivered to the British Ministry. It is public record. Ragnarok placed his hands flat on the table. The financial reclamation process has begun. Ministry-linked accounts are frozen. Ministry debts are called due. These actions are proceeding under treaty authority. Yes, Harry said. You have read the declaration. It wasn't a question. Twice, Harry said. And the founding charter. And the relevant sections of the 1752 and 1867 Accords. He paused. I've had some reading time. Something moved around the table, not quite a sound, more like a quality of attention changing. Several of the council members exchanged glances. Ragnarok's expression didn't change but his eyes did something, a slight intensification. Then you understand the grounds, Ragnarok said. 3 interlocking arguments, Harry said, because Nagnok hadn't told him not to demonstrate that he'd done the work and the work was relevant. The forged vault authorizations under the anti-fraud provisions. The fraudulent power of attorney on the Black estate, invalidated by Sirius Black's trial-free imprisonment. And the unauthorized access to my trust vault, which under the Potter family charter constitutes theft from a sovereign. He paused. The third argument is the strongest. It's the one the ICW will find hardest to dismiss because it's grounded in a charter that predates the ministry by 4 centuries. Ragnar looked at him steadily. That is a precise summary. I'm trying to understand what's happening to me, Harry said. Precise is easier than vague. Yes, Ragnar said. It is. He looked at Harry for a moment. I want to ask you something directly, Lord Potter. Go ahead. The declaration is in motion. The financial reclamation is in motion. These processes will continue regardless of what is decided in this room, because they are legally authorized and procedurally underway. He paused. But the form of those processes, the targets, the sequence, the endpoints, those are decisions that have not yet been finalized. We have the authority to proceed as we see fit. Another pause. We would rather proceed with your input. Why? Harry said. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. Because you are the primary victim of the crime that precipitated the declaration, Ragnar said. Because your family charter gives you standing as a sovereign client of this bank. And because, he stopped for a fraction of a second. Because your mother trusted us with something important and we failed that trust, and how we conduct this matter affects whether we deserve the trust she had in us. The chamber was very quiet. Harry looked at Ragnar for a long moment. He thought about Lily Potter writing a letter in a frightened hurry 4 days before she died, trusting that the goblins would be independent enough, honorable enough, to actually protect her son. He thought about what it meant that she'd been right about their character even if she'd been wrong about the execution. All right, Harry said. Then I want to tell you what I think the problem actually is. Ragnar gestured, a small motion, open-handed. Continue. The theft is the immediate problem, Harry said. The money, the vault accesses, the fraudulent power of attorney. That matters and I want it addressed. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But the theft was possible because of a bigger problem. One person was able to forge authorization paperwork, access a sealed trust vault 41 times, file a fraudulent power of attorney on a man in prison, and do all of this over 22 years without anyone stopping him, because he controlled enough of the institutional structure that the normal checks didn't work. He paused. The target isn't just the money. The target is the arrangement that made this possible. He had the full attention of the room in a way that was almost physical. 14 goblins who had been in councils and negotiations for longer than he'd been alive, and they were listening to him with the specific quality of attention that means this is more than we expected. The ministry's relationship with Gringotts, Harry said, is structured so that the ministry has enough influence over the liaison process that they were able to override your flagging alerts for 6 years without anyone catching it. That's a structural vulnerability, not a one-time failure. He looked at Ragnar. The declaration addresses the crime. It doesn't fix the structure. Ragnar leaned forward very slightly. What would fix it? Renegotiating the liaison agreement, Harry said. Under the terms of the 1752 Accord, I found this in the history book, I'm fairly sure about this, a war declaration gives Gringotts the right to demand treaty renegotiation as a condition of withdrawal. The ministry has to come to the table. He paused. I don't know enough about what the new terms should look like. I don't have enough experience. But you do. And if I formally support the renegotiation demand as the primary victim, as a sovereign account holder with standing under the family charter, that adds a layer of legitimacy to it that's harder to dismiss. The silence in the chamber had a different quality now. Ragnar was looking at Harry with an expression that was very still and very clear and not quite like anything Harry had seen on an adult's face before. It wasn't the recalibrating look that Bones did, and it wasn't the complicated warmth that Stroud had. It was something more direct than both of those. The look of someone recognizing something as equivalent to themselves. You've been in protective custody for 5 days, Ragnar said. Yes, Harry said. You're 7 years old. Yes. You read the treaty documents and found the renegotiation clause. Yes. Ragnar sat back. Nagnok, he said, without looking away from Harry. War Chief. The 1752 renegotiation clause. Is his reading of it correct? A pause. Substantively, yes. The procedural specifics are more complex, but the broad argument is sound. Ragnarok looked at Harry. Why are you supporting us? He said. We failed your mother. We failed you. You could have walked in here and demanded reclamation of the stolen funds and walked out. Instead you're proposing a strategic expansion of the Declaration's objectives. Because you're the only institution in magical Britain right now that Dumbledore can't reach, Harry said. The Ministry is compromised. The Wizengamot is fractured. The Prophet is being managed. But you're under treaty protection, you have ICW standing, and you've already declared war, which means you've already accepted that this is a confrontation and not a quiet negotiation. He looked at Ragnarok steadily. I need this to actually change things. Not just recover some money and punish some people. Actually change the structure so this can't happen again. He paused. And you need something that makes your declaration about more than Gringotts' interests alone. You need to be able to say it's about justice for a specific person who was wronged, not just institutional grievance. You're offering yourself as the moral center of the Declaration, Ragnarok said. I'm already the moral center of it, Harry said. I'm offering to be visibly and explicitly so. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his counsel. The look that went around the table was brief, the compressed communication of people who have worked together long enough to say things without words. Then Ragnarok looked back at Harry. The renegotiation demand will be incorporated into the Declaration's secondary filing, he said. With your formal support as the primary aggrieved party. He paused. In return, Gringotts will formally acknowledge your lordship, secure your vaults against any further unauthorized access under any authority, and assign permanent account management with full reporting directly to you, and only to you. He paused again. And we will pursue full reclamation of every galleon taken, with penalties under the anti-fraud provisions. Penalties meaning? Harry said. Triple the stolen sum, Bitterstone said from down the table. It's the standard punitive recovery rate under the founding charter. Harry thought about 847,000 galleons stolen from the Potter Vault alone. Tripled. That's a lot of money, he said. Yes, Ragnarok said. It is. Harry looked at Ragnarok. Where does it go? The penalty portion, over and above what was actually stolen. Ragnarok tilted his head slightly. By charter, that's at the discretion of the aggrieved party. Harry was quiet for a moment. I want to think about that, he said. There are things it could do that would matter more than sitting in my vault. He paused. Can I let you know? You have 30 days before the penalty disposition needs to be formalized, Bitterstone said. Good, Harry said. Ragnarok placed both hands flat on the table. Lord Potter. I want to ask you about one more thing. Go ahead. Sirius Black, Ragnarok said. His accounts are currently frozen pending resolution of the fraudulent power of attorney. Under Goblin law, he is legally a full person, his imprisonment without trial did not strip him of legal personhood. The accounts belong to him. He paused. If he were to be released from Azkaban, which would require a ministry proceeding of some kind, his accounts would be restored immediately under our law. Harry looked at him. You're telling me there's money available to fund a legal challenge to his imprisonment. I'm telling you that the Black family vault, once the fraudulent power of attorney is vacated, has assets in excess of 2 million galleons and that Black's legal personhood is intact under Goblin law. Ragnarok paused. What you do with that information is your business. Harry looked at the table for a moment. He thought about a name in a vault file, Sirius Black, imprisoned without trial, godfather listed in the Potter family records. A person who had been disappeared by the same system that had stolen from Harry and erased his memories and left him on a doorstep. I'll be talking to Amelia Bones about this, Harry said. I assumed as much, Ragnarok said. They took a break after an hour. Nagnok led Harry to a side room, smaller, warmer, with actual chairs instead of the council bench, and brought tea, which Harry suspected was a courtesy extended because he was human and humans apparently needed tea at intervals. He drank it. It was very good tea. He hadn't expected that. You did well, Nagnok said. He said it the same way he said everything, factual, level, not performing warmth but not withholding it either. The renegotiation clause, Harry said. Is it going to work? Will the ministry come to the table? They won't want to, Nagnok said. But the ICW filing makes refusal difficult. The ICW has member states with their own treaty relationships with Gringotts. If Britain is seen refusing mandatory renegotiation under treaty terms, those other states have grounds to apply pressure. He paused. The ministry is going to have a very difficult few weeks. Good, Harry said. Nagnok looked at him sideways. You're not particularly interested in being conciliatory. I'm 7, Harry said. I've been lied to, stolen from, and had 93 memories removed from my head. I'll be conciliatory later when there's something worth being conciliatory about. He drank his tea. Right now I want the structure changed so that whatever else happens, it can't happen the same way again. Sensible, Nagnok said. Who were the 3 men in expensive robes watching the declaration notice board? Harry said. The morning of the declaration. You saw them. I read it in your note to Ragnok. Nagnok was still for a moment. Then, you had access to internal council notes. Bones showed me the summary document. Your note was in it. He paused. Who were they? Ministry informants, Nagnok said. Working for the liaison office. Weatherby sent them to assess whether the declaration was real. He paused. They reported back that it was. And Weatherby reported to Dumbledore, Harry said. Through 2 intermediaries. Yes. Harry nodded. He drank his tea. Is there anything from the second part of the meeting I should know before we go back in? Nagnok looked at him for a moment. Ragnok is going to propose something specific at the end of the formal discussion, he said. I want to prepare you. What? He's going to offer you an account manager designation that goes beyond standard account management. Nagnok set down his own cup. He'd been drinking something darker that wasn't tea. Specifically, he's going to offer you a permanent liaison with direct access to the War Council's information resources for the duration of the declaration. Which means access to our intelligence network. Our financial monitoring. Our treaty communications. Harry looked at him. Why? Because you correctly identified that your value to this declaration is as its visible moral center, Nagnok said. And because a visible moral center who is also informed and strategically engaged is considerably more useful than one who is simply paraded. He paused. And because Ragnok read your mother's letter and has decided that making you a genuinely empowered participant in your own situation is the most direct way to begin repaying what was owed to her. Harry was quiet for a moment. The access wouldn't compromise the War Council's operations, he said. It will be appropriately bounded, Nagnok said. You'll have what's useful. Not everything. And I'd be working with you specifically. Yes, Nagnok said. I'd be your primary contact. Harry thought about that. He thought about the quality of his attention during the council meeting, the way Nagnok had walked beside him at his pace, briefed him without condescension, answered his questions as questions rather than as things that needed to be managed. The quality of being spoken to as equivalent. Okay, Harry said. Nagnok picked up his cup again. Drank. Said nothing. You've been doing this a long time, Harry said. The intelligence side. The strategy. Long enough, Nagnok said. Is Dumbledore going to see what's coming? Harry said. When the renegotiation demand is filed. Is he going to understand the full shape of it? He'll understand that we've expanded the declaration's scope, Nagnok said. He's intelligent enough to understand that a renegotiation of the liaison agreement threatens his access to the institutional channels he's been using. He paused. Whether he understands how quickly things are about to move, that depends on how much his certainty about his own judgment has been disrupted by recent events. Harry thought about Dumbledore standing in the hospital room doorway. The warmth, the sad patience, the absolute unshakable certainty. The moment of genuine complexity when Harry had named exactly what was happening and Dumbledore had, for just a moment, not had a ready response. His certainty has been disrupted, Harry said. Not enough. But some. Then he'll move, Nagnok said. Just slightly less precisely than usual. And slightly less precisely than usual is all we need. Back in the Chamber of Reckoning, the second half of the meeting covered the formal paperwork. Lordship acknowledgement, vault security upgrades, account management designation, all of it documented in triplicate on parchment that smelled of the deep storage of the bank, old and dry and very permanent. Harry signed his name. Harry James Potter. He looked at the signature for a moment. He'd written it hundreds of times, on school papers, on forms, on the back of library books at Privet Drive's local branch. It had always looked the same, ordinary, his, unremarkable. It looked different now. Not the letters. The same letters. Just the weight of what they were attached to. He set the quill down. Ragnarok looked at the signed document and made a small, satisfied sound that was very quiet and carried the quality of something concluded rather than something beginning. Though it was both. One more thing, Ragnarok said. Harry looked up. The Wisengamot session, Ragnarok said. Whenever it occurs. Gringotts will submit a formal representative to attend, under the treaty rights that give us observer status in proceedings that directly affect our declaration. He paused. This is not standard. We haven't exercised this right in 60 years. It means there'll be a goblin in the Wisengamot chamber, Harry said. It means there will be a goblin in the Wisengamot chamber who will be watching everything that happens and noting every procedural irregularity for the ICW record. Ragnarok's expression had something in it now that Harry recognized, the specific quality of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has just reached the beginning of the end of having to be. Let them be uncomfortable, he said. They've made others uncomfortable for long enough. Harry looked at him. What was it like, he said. After the last war, the 1752 one. What was the settlement like? Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Insufficient, he said. The terms were sufficient for that moment, for that immediate situation. But they were not durable. They created the vulnerabilities that led to this moment. He paused. This time we are not interested in sufficient. We are interested in durable. Good, Harry said. Me too. Ragnarok stood. It had the quality of a formal conclusion, not performed, just final. Nagnok will escort you out. The secondary declaration filing, incorporating the renegotiation demand, will be submitted to the ICW before midnight. Harry stood. He looked at Ragnarok, old, still, the product of decades of doing serious things seriously, and said, "Thank you. For taking my mother's letter seriously even late." Ragnarok looked at him for a moment. It should not have been late, he said. Simple. No deflection. No, Harry agreed. It shouldn't have. He turned and followed Nagnok toward the door. They were back in the stone corridor when Nagnok said, without preamble, the three men in expensive robes. The ministry informants. He didn't look at Harry as he said it. We identified them fully this afternoon. One of them has been providing information to Dumbledore directly, not through the ministry liaison, directly. He has a meeting scheduled with Dumbledore for tomorrow morning. You're going to monitor it, Harry said. We are going to be aware of it, Nagnok said, which was its own kind of yes. Is there anything I should do before tomorrow morning? Sleep, Nagnok said. You've been running on very little. Harry almost argued and then didn't, because it was true and arguing with true things was inefficient. Will you send word to Bones about the Sirius Black situation? The legal personhood angle under Goblin law. Already drafted, Nagnok said. She'll have it by tonight. They came out through the door into the banking hall, and the difference in light was sudden, the bright, familiar brightness of the main hall, marble and gold and the hum of ordinary banking business. After the phosphorescent deep stone quality of the chambers below, it felt almost loud. Harry looked at the hall. At the notice board with the declaration still posted. At the tellers at their high counters, the customers moving through the space. He thought about his mother, writing a letter in a frightened hurry, trusting that this institution, this ancient, complicated, fiercely independent institution, would protect her son. He thought about how the letter had been buried for 6 years before anyone looked. He thought about how he had walked in here today and sat across a stone table from a war chief and talked about treaty clauses and structural reform and punitive recovery penalties, and how none of it had felt impossible or overwhelming, how it had felt necessary. Like the natural activity of someone who has looked at a problem and decided to solve it rather than wait for someone else to. He walked through the main hall and out through the bronze doors into the sunshine of Diagon Alley. Bones was waiting at the bottom of the steps with Clearwater and the plainclothes officers. She looked at him with the assessing quality she always had, and then her eyes moved to something behind him, presumably Nagnok, standing in the doorway, and then back. "How did it go?" she said. Harry looked up at her. The July sun was warm and the alley was full of its ordinary business, and somewhere in the building behind him a war declaration had just grown several significant clauses and a 7-year-old had signed his name to it with the full legal weight of a 400-year-old family charter behind him. "Well," he said. "I think it went well." He paused. "We need to talk about Sirius Black." Bones went very still. "Tonight, if possible," Harry said. "Nagnok's sending you something. Read it first, then let's talk." He started toward the car. The alley moved around him, oblivious witches and wizards going about their days, none of them knowing yet that the shape of things had shifted again, in a basement chamber under a marble bank, over tea and signed parchment and a 7-year-old who had spent his time in a hospital room reading instead of waiting. Behind him, he heard Nagnok's footstep on the top step, brief, precise, and then the bronze doors closing. The sun was warm. He kept walking. Chapter 6, The Weight of Stolen Years. The Wizengamot session was called for a Friday. Dumbledore had pushed for Thursday. Augusta Longbottom, who had received the conflict of interest ruling on Wednesday afternoon, 3 hours after the Wizengamot clerk processed Marchbanks's challenge and 2 hours after a panel of 3 senior legal advisors confirmed it was procedurally airtight, pushed back for Friday, which gave Bones 1 additional day to prepare, and which also gave the Gringotts secondary filing time to reach every ICW member nation and come back to Britain as confirmed international record before the session began. Augusta Longbottom had pushed for Friday with the particular energy of a woman who had been waiting a long time to push for something and was making the most of the opportunity. The ruling had stripped Dumbledore of the chair. He could attend as a member of the body, his seat was his, that couldn't be touched, but the gavel was Augusta's, and the agenda was Augusta's, and the order of proceedings was Augusta's, and everyone in magical Britain who understood how the Wizengamot actually functioned understood what that meant. The prophet ran it as a small story on page 4. Someone had worked hard to keep it small. The story on page 1 was about a proposed amendment to the Quidditch regulations. Harry read both stories at breakfast on Thursday. He read the page 4 story twice, then set the paper down and looked out the window of his room. He was still at St. Mungo's, the protective custody technically still in force, which was fine because the hospital was familiar now and the room was his in the way that any space became yours after enough days, and thought about the session tomorrow. He thought about 82 witches and wizards in one room, and Dumbledore sitting among them rather than above them for the first time in years, and Augusta Longbottom with a gavel and a very particular kind of patience. He thought about what he needed to say. Bones had asked him, 2 nights ago over the Sirius Black conversation, whether he wanted to speak at the session. Not as a witness, as a party. As Lord Potter, withstanding under the Magical Minors Act and the Gringotts Declaration, with the formal right to address the body on matters affecting his welfare and his accounts. It'll be difficult, she'd said. They'll try to use your age against you. Some of them will be kind about it, which is almost worse, treating you like a confused child who's been filled with ideas he doesn't understand. And Dumbledore will be patient and sad, Harry had said. Yes. He'd thought about it for a moment. I want to speak, he said. But not first. I want to let the evidence go first. The authenticated documentation, the medical record from St. Mungo's, the Gringotts financial record. I want the numbers in the room before I am. Bones had looked at him for a moment. You want them to understand what they're looking at before they see who they're looking at. I want the facts established before the feelings start, Harry said. Because the feelings are going to be complicated. Some of them will feel protective of me, some of them will feel protective of Dumbledore, some of them are just protecting themselves. But the numbers are the same regardless of the feelings. That's a sound approach, Bones had said. Tell Augusta Longbottom, Harry had said. She had. The morning of the session, Nagnock arrived at St. Mungo's at 7 with a sealed document and a look of deliberate composure. Harry opened the document. Read it. Looked up. Sirius Black, he said. The legal challenge was filed at midnight, Nagnock said. Under the provisions of the 1752 Accord, specifically the clause regarding Goblin financial standing being tied to the legal personhood of their clients, Gringotts has the right to petition for a formal legal determination on any client whose personhood is in dispute. He paused. We argued that Black's personhood is in dispute because his imprisonment without trial has never been legally resolved, and that the fraudulent power of attorney filed on his behalf can only be permanently vacated by a proper hearing determining his legal status. You forced their hand, Harry said. The ministry has to hold a hearing now or breach the treaty. The hearing is scheduled for next week, Nagnock said. Separate from today's session. But the filing is already ICW record. If the ministry tries to block or delay the hearing, the ICW gets involved. He paused. Amelia Bones has already indicated she will prosecute personally. Harry looked at the document again. Sirius Black, who had been in Azkaban for 6 years, imprisoned without trial, for a crime that Harry was, the more he'd learned, the more he was, genuinely uncertain he'd committed. The evidence Bones had laid out was the evidence of chaos and grief and a system that had needed a culprit quickly and had taken the one that was available. He thought about his mother's letter. Ensure Harry's lordship is properly established before anyone takes guardianship decisions. She'd written it knowing something was going to happen, knowing who she trusted and who she didn't, knowing that the official structures were compromised. She hadn't written to Dumbledore. She hadn't written to the ministry. She'd written to Gringotts. And in the will on file at Gringotts, the real will, the one that hadn't been presented at any official proceeding, the designated guardian for Harry James Potter, in the event of the deaths of James and Lily Potter, was Sirius Orain Black. He should have been raising me, Harry said. Yes, Nagnock said. Simply. Harry folded the document and set it on the table with the same careful precision he'd been developing for important papers. Not delicate. Just deliberate. After today, he said. After the session. Whatever happens, the Sirius Black hearing is the next thing. Agreed, Nagnock said. They arrived at the Ministry of Magic at 9:30. Not through the visitor entrance, not through the public flue or the telephone box. Through the official entrance reserved for treaty delegations and party representatives with formal standing, which was a door on a side street that most people didn't know existed and which had a direct corridor to the Wizengamot chamber level. The Gringotts delegation entered alongside Harry's party, Nagnock and 2 ward council members in formal attire, the first goblins to enter the Wizengamot chamber in active capacity since 1965. They walked without drama. They didn't need drama. The fact of their presence was sufficient. Harry wore the same charcoal robes from the Gringotts meeting. He'd asked Bones if that was appropriate. "It's your choice," she'd said. "Then yes," he'd said. The corridor to the Wisengamot chamber was longer than Harry had expected, a long, windowless stretch of ministry stone that had the particular atmosphere of a place designed to impress through scale and through making you walk far enough to feel small before you arrived. Harry noticed this and walked at a pace that said he'd noticed it and had decided to be unbothered by it, which was more effective than trying to look unbothered. The chamber doors were heavy wood banded in iron. 2 ministry officials opened them as the party approached, and the sound that came out, the low, dense hum of 82 witches and wizards in a closed space, all talking at once, hit like a wave. Harry walked in. The chamber was tiered. Curved rows of seats rising in a horseshoe shape around a central floor, the floor where parties stood when they addressed the body. At the apex of the horseshoe, the presiding chair, and in it Augusta Longbottom with a spine like a ruler and an expression that suggested she had not slept heavily last night and had made productive use of the waking hours. The noise in the room dropped by half when Harry walked through the doors. Not to silence. To a lower register of the same buzz, the sound of 82 people adjusting their conversation to incorporate a new variable. Harry felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. He kept walking. Bones and Clearwater and Marchbanks went to the party bench on the left. The Gringotts delegation went to the observer bench, a bench that had not had anyone in it for 60 years and had been hastily dusted that morning, which Harry somehow knew without having been told. Nagnok sat in the center of it with his arms folded and his dark eyes making a slow, comprehensive survey of the room. Harry went to the party floor. He stood there. He was the smallest person in the chamber by a significant margin. He stood there and let the room look at him and looked back, unhurried. Somewhere in the upper left section of the tiered seating, he'd been briefed on the approximate location. Dumbledore sat in his member's seat. Harry didn't look directly at him. He was aware of the general direction the way you're aware of a warm front, present, noted, not the main event. Augusta Longbottom raised her gavel and brought it down once. The room finished settling. "This emergency session of the Wisengamot is convened," she said, in a voice that could have filled the room without any amplification charm and had them anyway, under the provisions of the Magical Minors Act 1990 and the Supplementary Emergency Session Charter. "The subject of today's session is the welfare and legal standing of Harry James Potter, and all matters bearing directly on those concerns." She looked at the room. "The agenda has been set by the presiding chair. We will proceed in the following order. First, submission and acknowledgement of documentary evidence. Second, testimony from ministry officials. Third, testimony from medical professionals. Fourth, address by the party of interest." She paused. "Questions from the floor will be taken after each submission. The presiding chair will determine relevance. Irrelevant questions will not be entertained. We will move efficiently." This last sentence was aimed at approximately no one in particular and everyone specifically. "First submission," Augusta said. "The Gringotts authenticated financial record and ward declaration documentation. Copies have been distributed to all members. You have them in front of you. You will take 10 minutes to review the summary pages before we proceed." The room rustled. Parchment. 82 people opening documents. The sound of numbers being read. Harry stood on the party floor and waited. He heard the quality of the silence in the room change as people got to the summary page. The figure, 847,000 galleons from the Potter vault alone, plus the Black Estate claims, plus the penalties, had a particular effect on a room of people, most of whom dealt in money and understood immediately what that number meant and what tripled meant. 10 minutes. "Acknowledged," Augusta said. "The Gringotts documentation is entered into the session record. Questions from the floor on the financial record." Several hands went up. Augusta worked through them with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting for this and has prepared. Questions about authentication standards, answered by a Gringotts legal representative who spoke from the observer bench with the flat precision of someone who finds the question slightly insulting. Questions about the war declaration's legal basis, answered by Marchbanks, who had the relevant treaty citations memorized. One question, from a member Harry had identified as one of Dumbledore's 17 petitioners, about whether the goblin definition of sovereign account holder was applicable under British magical law. The family charter predates British magical law, Marchbanks said pleasantly. The question of applicability runs in the other direction. Augusta moved on. Healer Ogilvy testified for 20 minutes. He was precise and calm and gave the medical evidence the same quality of complete, unambiguous factuality that he brought to everything. 93 instances. 4 target categories. Confirmed by full diagnostic scan, double confirmed by parallel recording charm, signed by 2 senior healers and submitted under mandatory reporting requirements of the Magical Minors Act. The room was very quiet during his testimony. Healer Stroud testified after him. She gave the same facts and then, when Augusta asked if she had anything further, she said yes, and read out Lily Potter's letter, the original held at Gringotts, the text entered into the session record, in a clear, steady voice that did not waver once. The room was still quiet. A different quality of quiet, now. The quiet of a group of people who have been confronted with something they cannot explain away and who are in the process of deciding what to do with that. Augusta took the room through Arabella Figg's submitted statement. She read the relevant sections herself, directly, without editorializing, the dates, the reports made to Dumbledore, his responses. From the upper left section of the room, no sound. Then the ministry testimony. 3 officials Harry didn't know personally but whose signatures appeared in various administrative capacities on the fraudulent documentation. All 3 had submitted their statements in writing rather than appearing in person, which Augusta noted for the record with an inflection that made its own comment. Clearwater presented the DMLE's compiled investigative findings. She was good at this, the kind of thorough, methodical evidence presentation that didn't need to editorialize because it was assembled in an order that made the shape of things obvious. She walked the room through the chain of authorizations, the forged signatures, the override requests filed through the Ministry Liaison Office. She named Weatherby. She named the 3 ministry officials. She named the signatures cross-matched with St. Mungo's diagnostic data. She said the name Albus Dumbledore 7 times, in 7 different evidentiary contexts, none of them ambiguous. After Clearwater finished, Augusta said, "Questions from the floor." Hands went up. Augusta worked through them. Several questions that were genuinely clarifying. Several that were attempts at deflection, introducing alternative interpretations, suggesting documentation errors, implying procedural irregularities in the DMLE's investigation. Augusta dispatched these with the focused efficiency of someone who has read the documentation more carefully than the people trying to poke holes in it. One hand went up that Augusta hadn't expected. Harry saw her pause, just fractionally, before acknowledging it. "Professor Dumbledore," she said. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just the specific quality of 82 people adjusting their attention simultaneously. Dumbledore stood. He was tall even in the members section and his voice carried easily, warm and measured, the voice Harry had heard in his hospital room. "Thank you, Acting Presiding Witch Longbottom." The title was technically correct and he used it with the grace of a man who has decided that dignity requires him to accept a situation rather than fight it publicly. "I simply want to note, for the record, that I intend to address the evidentiary questions raised today fully and completely in the appropriate legal forum. I am not here to obstruct these proceedings. I am here as a member of this body with a sincere interest in the well-being of Harry Potter, and I would ask that the body keep that well-being, rather than political considerations, at the center of today's discussion." He sat down. The room processed this. Harry, standing on the party floor, looked up at the upper left section for the first time. Dumbledore was looking back at him. The look was complex. Genuine in its complexity. The sadness was real, Harry thought. The care, in its way, was real. None of which changed anything. Harry held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Augusta. "The party of interest will now address the body," Augusta said. She looked at Harry with the specific attention of someone who has been briefed and is now confirming that the briefing was accurate. Lord Potter. Harry walked 3 steps to the center of the floor. He stopped. He was standing in a circle of space with 82 witches and wizards tiered around him and a war council's worth of goblin attention from the observer bench and Amelia Bones on the party bench and Augusta Longbottom at the apex with her gavel and her ruler spine. He was 7 years old. He was the smallest person in the room. He stood like he owned the floor, which under the terms of his family charter and the Wisengamot's own rules, he did. He looked at the room. Not at any specific person. At the whole of it. "I've been told," he said, and his voice was clear and carried without difficulty, which was a thing he noticed without being surprised by, "that I should be careful about how I say what I need to say today. That I should be measured. That I should be aware of the complexity of the situation and of the relationships in this room and of the fact that I'm 7 years old and that some of what I'm going to say will sound very large coming from someone my size." A pause. "I've thought about that advice," Harry said. "And I've decided to say what I actually think, because the problem with being measured about this is that being measured implies there are 2 reasonable sides, and there aren't." He let that settle for exactly 1 second. "There's a record of 93 deliberate memory wipes performed on me beginning when I was 14 months old. There's a record of 847,000 galleons taken from my family's vault using forged authorization. There's a record of a godfather imprisoned without trial while someone filed a fraudulent power of attorney on his behalf and redirected his family's assets. There's a record of a placement decision that put me with guardians who, the DMLE investigation documents this, were aware of the memory wipes and accepted payment for their cooperation with the arrangement." He heard the room move at that last sentence. Payment. It was in Clearwater's report. He'd known it would land. "All of that is documented," Harry said. "Authenticated. On the record. I'm not asking you to take my word for any of it. I'm asking you to do something with the record that already exists." He looked at the room. "I'm going to tell you what was taken," he said. "Not the money, you've read those numbers. The other things." He paused. "The first category of wipes was moments of accidental magic. The big ones, the ones that would have told me what I was capable of. I grew up not knowing. Not because I lacked ability, but because every time I demonstrated it to myself it was removed." He kept his voice level. Not cold. Level. "The second category was connection. Times I felt I belonged somewhere. Felt cared for. The third was knowledge of my own family, who my parents were, what happened to them, what I come from. I was told my parents died in a car crash. I believed that for 7 years." He paused. "The fourth category was confidence. Moments when I was certain of something. Certain of my own mind. Someone decided, repeatedly, that I should not have those moments." The room was completely still. "I'm not standing here because I want sympathy," Harry said. "I want something specific. I want the investigation to proceed without interference, through a legal framework that cannot be reached by anyone whose name is in the evidence. I want the treaty renegotiation demanded by Gringotts to go forward, because the structural vulnerability that made this possible is more important than the specific crime. I want a hearing for Sirius Black, who should have been raising me, who was disappeared by the same system that did this, and I want it conducted honestly." He looked at Augusta. "And I want it on the record, formally, that what was done to me was not done for my benefit. It was done for the benefit of people who needed me manageable." He said that word the way he'd said it to Dumbledore in the hospital room. With the same flatness. The same complete refusal to dress it up. "That's what I'm asking for," Harry said. "The record to mean something. The accountability to be real. And the structure to change." He paused. "Because I'm 7 years old and I've spent my reading time this week learning enough Wisengamot procedure and treaty law to understand what's actually possible in this room today, and what's possible is significant, if the people in this room decide to let it be. He stopped. He'd said what he needed to say. He stood in the circle of his own floor and waited. The room was quiet for 3 full seconds, which in a chamber of 82 people is a very long time. Then Augusta Longbottom brought her gavel down once and said, with a crispness that carried decades of satisfaction in it, "We will move to floor deliberation." The deliberation took 2 hours. Harry sat on the party bench with Bones and Clearwater and watched the room work. Augusta ran it with unflinching precision, cutting off the deflections, refusing the attempts at procedural delay, steering the body back to the documented record every time someone tried to introduce ambiguity into something that the documents made unambiguous. Dumbledore spoke twice. Both times he was warm, measured, and careful. Both times he used the word context, arguing for a fuller understanding of the historical situation, the pressures of the post-war period, the genuine difficulty of the choices made. Both times Augusta acknowledged his contribution and moved on without letting it reframe the agenda. He was good. Harry watched him work and acknowledged, privately, that he was very good. A lesser room would have followed him. This room had the Gringotts documentation in front of them and is St. Mungo's medical record in front of them and Clearwater's investigative findings in front of them, and the people in this room were the kind of people who understood what authenticated evidence meant, and Dumbledore's warmth and context were finding less purchase than they would have in a room with fewer documents. By the end of the first hour it was clear that the votes were there. Not unanimously, there were 17 members whose position was fixed regardless of evidence, and a further handful who were genuinely uncertain, who found the documented scale of things hard to absorb and were doing what uncertain people do in formal settings, which is delay. But the shape of the majority was visible, and Augusta was steering toward it with the patient precision of someone following a map she'd drawn herself. The formal resolutions were voted through at noon. The investigation into financial fraud and unauthorized magical interference was formally endorsed by the Wisengamot, with a mandate to proceed through a special independent legal commission that reported directly to the body rather than through the standard ministry channels. This was the structural piece, removing the investigation from the reach of any individual ministry official. The Gringotts treaty renegotiation demand was formally acknowledged and a ministry delegation authorized to negotiate in good faith within 60 days. The Sirius Black hearing was ordered for the following week, before an independent judicial panel, with Amelia Bones as lead prosecutor. Dumbledore was placed under formal administrative review, not charges, not yet. The evidence process had its own timeline, but the review stripped him of his ability to take any action as a designated guardian or magical representative for Harry Potter, effective immediately. It also suspended his chief warlock status pending the investigation's conclusion. The gavel came down on each resolution with the sound of something irreversible. After the 4th resolution passed, Harry looked at the observer bench. Nagnok was watching the proceedings with his arms folded and his dark eyes taking a slow, careful count of the voting hands. He looked like someone watching numbers confirm what they already knew, which was a satisfying thing to watch. The room broke into something between formal and informal as members began to move. Some came down to the party floor, mostly the ones who'd voted for all 4 resolutions and wanted proximity to the event. Augusta descended from the presiding chair with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees weren't what they'd been but who wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing it. She came to Harry. "Lord Potter," she said. "Thank you," Harry said. "For the chair." "Thank Marchbanks," Augusta said. She filed the challenge. "I just sat in it." She looked at him with sharp, bright eyes that had seen a very great deal and assessed it accurately. "Your statement was exactly right." "I thought about it for 3 days," Harry said. "I know," she said, which surprised him. "Bones told me. She said you rewrote it 4 times. A pause. "The version you gave was better than the first 3. Harry wasn't sure how she knew what the first 3 had sounded like. He decided this was not a mystery worth pursuing right now. Across the room, Dumbledore was speaking with 2 members who were listening with the expression of people who are sympathetic but aware that sympathy has a limited operational range today. His back was to Harry. After a moment, as if feeling the attention, he turned. They looked at each other across the chamber floor. Harry didn't look away. Didn't perform anything, not defiance, not coldness. Just looked, clearly and without flinching, the way he'd been looking at things since a diagnostic instrument in a hospital room had produced a number that changed the shape of his world. Dumbledore looked back at him. The warmth was still there in his expression. The sadness. And underneath both of those, something that Harry hadn't seen before, or hadn't fully registered. Something that looked like the beginning of a genuine reckoning. Not enough. Not yet. But the beginning of it. He turned away first. Went back to his conversation. Harry let it go and turned to find Nagnok at his shoulder. The secondary filing responses are coming in from ICW member nations, Nagnok said, quietly. 7 responses already. All acknowledgements. Good, Harry said. The ministry will have its delegation names to us within 48 hours for the renegotiation talks, Nagnok said. Bitterstone is leading our team. She's prepared. She was impressive in the council meeting, Harry said. She's been preparing for this renegotiation for 15 years, Nagnok said. She has drafts. He paused. She has very thorough drafts. They were in the corridor outside the chamber when Petunia Dursley walked in. She was with 2 DMLE officers and a ministry official Harry didn't recognize, and she was wearing her best Muggle clothes and carrying her handbag with both hands in front of her the way she'd done in the St. Mungo's waiting room. She looked like she had been trying very hard to look like herself and had only partially succeeded. She saw Harry. She stopped. The DMLE officers kept walking and then paused when they realized she'd stopped, and the ministry official made an indeterminate sound and stepped to the side. Harry looked at Petunia. She looked at Harry. He thought about everything he'd read in Clearwater's report about the Dursleys. The payment, a modest sum, transferred quarterly from a ministry disbursement account that traced back to an authorization signed by Albus Dumbledore. Payment for housing the boy and maintaining a specific domestic atmosphere and not asking questions. Payment that they'd accepted and kept accepting for 6 years. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs. The spare room that had been Dudley's junk room and hadn't become Harry's actual bedroom until Harry had been told by some instinct he couldn't name that the cupboard was wrong, that it was wrong in a way that mattered, and had said so with enough force that the Dursleys had moved him upstairs without entirely understanding why they were doing it. He thought about what Petunia had looked like standing at the kitchen counter with the ministry letter in her hand. He'd watched through the kitchen doorway before she called him. She'd looked frightened. She'd looked like a woman who had been afraid of something for a very long time and had just been handed confirmation that the thing she was afraid of was real. He thought about all of that. Mrs. Dursley, he said. Her hands moved on the handbag. Harry. Her voice was doing something unfamiliar, stripped of the rigid control she usually had over it. They said there would be a, she stopped. Started again. I've given a statement. I've told them everything. I know, Harry said. I want you to know, she stopped again. She looked like someone trying to say a thing they've rehearsed and finding that the rehearsed version doesn't fit the actual moment. I want you to know that I knew it was wrong. That I knew when we were doing it that it was wrong. Not all of it was something we chose. Dumbledore was very, yes, Harry said. He was. But some of it we chose, she said. And the way she said it, flat, undecorated, no excuse attached, told Harry more about who Petunia Dursley actually was underneath the rigid management of herself than anything he'd observed in 7 years of living in her house. The cupboard. The way we talked to you. The way we let Dudley, she stopped. We chose those things. He didn't make us do those things. Harry looked at her for a moment. He thought about what he'd said to Arabella Figg. That you came here and told me the truth yourself counts. Not for everything. But it counts. What happens to you now is between you and Amelia Bones, he said. I'm not going to tell you it's fine. No, Petunia said. I know. But. He paused. He was thinking about what was true, and what was useful, and whether there was a version of this moment that gave Petunia Dursley something worth carrying out of this corridor. You loved him, Harry said. My mother. You loved him and then he died and that's a real thing. That happened and it was real. And whatever else is true about what came after, that part, that's real. Petunia looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Yes, she said, very quietly. That part is real. Harry looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned away and kept walking, because there wasn't more to say, and standing in the corridor of the Ministry of Magic saying less than there was to say was better than staying in searching for more. Outside, the London afternoon had clouded over while they were inside. The sky was the soft, even grey of coming rain, and the air had that particular quality of a city just before a summer storm, thick and still and charged. Bones stood beside the car. She looked at Harry when he came out and did a quick professional assessment, the kind she'd been doing since the first day, and apparently concluded that what she saw was acceptable. Good session, she said. Good chair, Harry said. Augusta will be insufferable for months, Bones said. In the best possible way. She paused. Gringotts' first financial strike lands tonight at midnight. The ministry debt calls. 47 accounts frozen. Weatherby's office accounts are first. Does Fudge know? He's been notified. His response was, she paused. He released a statement this afternoon expressing his full cooperation with the investigation and his intention to ensure the ministry's financial obligations are met in a timely and transparent manner. He's cutting Dumbledore loose, Harry said. In the elegant way that Fudge does these things, yes. She looked at the grey sky. The Prophet will run the full session coverage tomorrow morning. One of our people made sure the right journalist had access. Harry thought about the page 4 story that morning. The Quidditch amendment on page 1. Whoever was managing their coverage is going to have a difficult night. Several difficult nights, Bones agreed. Harry looked at the street. Ordinary London going about its Thursday, the city indifferent to what had happened inside the ministry building. He thought about how much of the world operated like this, enormous things happening in specific rooms while outside, everything continued. Sirius Black, he said. Next week, Bones said. I've been building the case since you first mentioned it. The evidence for wrongful imprisonment is, she paused. It's substantial. I'm not going to guarantee the outcome, because hearings aren't guaranteed, but the evidence is substantial. What does he know? Harry said. Sirius. About any of this? We've sent word to Azkaban through official channels, Bones said. A formal notification that a hearing has been ordered. That he has legal representation, Gringotts is providing their own solicitor given the financial personhood argument. She paused. That's all he knows. Harry thought about a man in Azkaban for 6 years, innocent or not innocent but certainly untried, receiving a formal notification that a hearing had been ordered. What that would feel like. What 6 years in Azkaban did to a person. What it would mean to come out into a world where, apparently, a 7-year-old had been conducting a campaign on his behalf using treaty clauses and authenticated audit documents. When he gets out, Harry said, if he gets out, when, Bones said firmly. He's going to have a lot to catch up on. You can brief him, Bones said. Harry looked at her. I've never met him. You've never met him yet, she said. That evening, Harry sat in his hospital room for what he'd already decided was the last night he was going to spend there. Tomorrow, Bones had arrangements in place, a safe house under the DMLE's direct protective authority, proper rooms, access to an actual library, and a fireplace with Fleur connection to Nagnak's office at Gringotts. He sat at the window as the rain started, light at first, then proper summer rain, the kind that cleaned the city and made the rooftops shine and sent the pigeons under whatever shelter they could find. He thought about 93. He thought about what 93 moments of reduction, deliberate, targeted, someone else's hand reaching into his mind and choosing what he got to keep, had actually done. Not what had been taken. What had been made from the taking. Because here was the thing he'd been turning over for 8 days, since a diagnostic instrument had shown him a number and a kind woman had told him what kind of spell it was, the erasures hadn't worked. Not ultimately. Not in the way they were intended. They'd taken the specific memories, yes, those were gone and some would come back fragmentarily and some were simply gone, but the person who had those memories, the person who had stood in that garden knowing the trees could hear him, who had known one clear second on a playground that he was fast and capable, who had sat in a warm kitchen with a laughing woman with red hair, that person had grown back. 93 times. Kept growing back, messier and less manageable and more himself each time, because you can take the evidence of who someone is but you cannot reach the source. He'd been reduced 93 times and had come back 93 times, and now he was sitting in a hospital window on the 94th day, counting from the scan, from the moment the number had landed, and he was exactly himself, and the fury was still there, clean and bright and not going anywhere, and underneath it was something that had been there all along waiting for the space to be acknowledged. He was his mother's son. He was his father's son. He was the child of two people who had been, by every account he'd gathered in 8 days of careful questioning, genuinely good, not perfect, but genuinely good, which was better, and who had trusted specific things and specific people with specific and precise reasons. He was the occupant of a vault that bore a charter from 1243 and a lordship that had accrued at his 7th birthday and a name that was his, had always been his, was only his. He was the person Dumbledore had spent 6 years trying to make small, and who had grown back. He looked at the rain on the rooftops. He thought about what came next. The Sirius Black hearing. The treaty renegotiation. The long process of the independent investigation and whatever it produced. The memories that might still surface, warm or sharp or partial, given back by a magical core that had spent years quietly rejecting what had been forced on it. Hogwarts in 4 years. Everything that was apparently coming that Dumbledore had referenced, the forces in motion, the thing he was supposed to face. He thought about all of that and felt, not small. Not overwhelmed. Not the particular uncertainty that had been the background noise of 7 years lived in a house where he was managed rather than loved. He felt what he'd pressed into himself like a seal into wax, standing in the hospital room the night of the 3rd day. 93 reductions and 93 recoveries, and here was the 94th day, the day the record had been read aloud in the Wisengamot chamber, the day the gavel had come down on 4 resolutions, the day Petunia Dursley had said that part is real in a ministry corridor, the day Gringotts was preparing to freeze 47 accounts at midnight. The day the structure had started to change. He reached for the book on the shelf, not the Wisengamot procedure guide, not the Goblin law history, the magical history text from the first night. He opened it to the back, to a page he'd marked with a folded corner. A short section titled On the Establishment of Wizarding Rites, a Continuing Process. He read it as the rain came harder against the glass. Then he picked up the quill and the small notepad the Medowitch had brought him. She'd been bringing him things he needed before he asked, which he'd noticed and appreciated, and he began to write. Not a speech. Not a strategy document. Just a list of names, people he owed something to, things he intended to do, questions that still needed answers. Healer Stroud, who had looked at a number on a piece of parchment and called Amelia Bones instead of routing it through channels. Nagnock, who had walked at his pace without making it obvious. Augusta Longbottom and her gavel. Arabella Figg, who had come to the hospital to tell him herself. His mother, who had trusted the right institution for the right reasons and been failed by timing and had tried anyway. Sirius Black, who was in Azkaban right now, who would find out next week that something had moved. He wrote until the rain eased off into the soft, steady pattern of a summer night, and then he set the notepad down and looked at the wet rooftops and the city reflecting back its own lights in the puddles and the streaming windows, bright and ordinary and entirely unaware of the weight of what had been set in motion in its upper rooms. He was 7 years old. He had 93 stolen moments and a fury that wasn't going anywhere and a name that was his and a bank that had declared war on his behalf and a list of things that were going to happen, one after another, for as long as it took. He was his mother's son. He closed the notepad. He turned off the bedside light. Outside, the city went on. The rain went on. Somewhere beneath a marble building on a street that tourists walked past without seeing, goblins in bronze armor stood at their posts and a clock moved toward midnight and 47 ministry accounts waited, unsuspecting, for what was coming. Harry lay in the dark with his hands at his sides and let himself feel all of it, the weight of 93 stolen years and the clean, absolute certainty of everything he was going to do about them. Then he closed his eyes and slept, and did not dream of the cupboard or the kitchen floor or the careful voice that had always, just before understanding, reached in and made him smaller. He dreamed of a garden with big trees that he knew, even in sleep, were listening. He dreamed of red hair and a warm kitchen and a woman laughing. He let it stay.